The red dust hung thick in the evening air, painting the Colorado sky in hues of blood and fire. Elias Creed pulled back on the reins, bringing his dun mare to a halt at the crest of the hill. His weathered face, etched with lines of a man who'd seen more than his share of sorrow, tensed as he surveyed what lay below. 40 acres of tired land, a weathered two-story farmhouse, and something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree, hung the unmistakable silhouette of a human body. "Christ almighty," he muttered, reaching for the brass spyglass in his saddlebag. The years of war had taught him to approach danger with cold calculation. Through the lens, the hanging figure came into terrible focus. A woman impossibly tall, her frame still swaying weakly in the evening breeze, legs kicking in exhausted panic. The Springfield rifle was in his hands before conscious thought, and he spurred his horse down the slope. 3 weeks of hard riding from Virginia, carrying the burden of memories heavier than his saddlebags, and Elias had finally arrived at what was supposed to be his last chance for redemption, a place to disappear from a world that had taken everything from him. Instead, he'd found this. As he drew closer, the woman's desperate situation became clearer. The rope dug deep into her neck, leaving angry red welts against pale skin. Wheezing, ragged gasps escaped her throat, barely louder than the wind through the cracked walls of the barn. This was no formal execution. There was no crowd, no lawman, no written proclamation. Just a dying woman and a rope on his newly purchased property. Elias felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the same detachment that had allowed him to survive Gettysburg Antietam and a dozen lesser hells during the war. The smart choice would be to turn around, ride back to town, and demand answers. This wasn't his burden. This wasn't his fight. But then the woman's eyes found his, pale blue, wide with pain and desperation. Not hatred, not the fury of battle, but a silent plea that pierced the armor he'd built around what remained of his soul. And in those eyes, Elias saw the ghost of another face. Mary, his 8-year-old daughter, eyes glassy with fever, reaching for him in the delirium of her final hours. Hours when he had been hundreds of miles away, fighting for a cause that had long since lost its meaning. "Not this time," he whispered. Before he could reconsider, Elias swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud that sent dust spiraling upward. He moved quickly to the base of the oak, drawing the hunting knife from his belt. With one swift motion, he severed the rope. The woman's body collapsed in a heap, kicking up a cloud of red dust. Elias knelt beside her, rough hands gently turning her onto her back. Her skin burned hot to the touch, each breath coming in short, broken gasps. He pressed weathered fingers to her neck, feeling the faint, faltering pulse beneath. "Still alive," he muttered, unsure if he was speaking to her or to himself. He retrieved his canteen, supporting her head as he trickled water between her cracked lips. After a few tentative sips, a faint moan escaped her. Her eyelids fluttered heavy and slow before opening to reveal those same pale blue eyes, now filled with confusion and lingering panic. "Easy now," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe." The woman was unlike any he had ever seen. She stood nearly 7 feet tall when he helped her to sit up, with broad shoulders and arms corded with muscle. Not the soft curves of a society woman, but the hard-earned strength of someone who had worked the land. Yet her face, though weathered by sun and hardship, held a youthfulness that suggested she was no more than 30. Her lips moved, and out came a fractured whisper. "Cain sold me. Left me." The name hit Elias like a blade to the gut. Samuel Cain, the man who had sold him this land just 3 weeks prior in a transaction that had seemed too rushed, too eager. The price had been surprisingly low, the paperwork hastily arranged. "Samuel Cain?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. The woman nodded weakly, her hand moving to her throat where the rope had cut deep enough to leave what would surely become another scar among the many that already marked her pale skin. "He said I was payment," she managed, before a fit of coughing overtook her. Elias helped her to her feet, supporting her towering frame as they made their way to the farmhouse. As they crossed the yard, his experienced eyes took in details he had missed in the urgency of the moment. The door to the house had been recently painted. A field to the east showed signs of being half-tilled. The livestock pens, though empty, contained fresh straw. This wasn't an abandoned property at all. Someone, likely this woman, had been working it right until Cain had decided to sell. Inside the house was sparse but not empty, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a bookshelf with a handful of worn volumes, a straw mattress in the corner. Elias helped the woman onto it, then lit the oil lamp hanging from a hook in the ceiling. "What's your name?" he asked as he poured water from his canteen into a chipped ceramic bowl. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Nordstrom." Elias tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and dipped it in the water, gently cleaning the wound on her neck. "I'm Elias Creed. It seems we've both been deceived by Samuel Kane." Sarah's eyes fixed on him, wary but no longer panicked. "You bought the farm." "Every acre, signed and paid for 3 weeks ago." Elias's mouth tightened into a grim line. Though it seems Kane left out some significant details about the property. As Sarah's breathing steadied, Elias moved to the kitchen area, searching through the sparse furnishings. He found a half loaf of stale bread and a jar of preserved peaches. Not much, but it would have to do for now. "You need to eat," he said, returning to her side. Sarah accepted the food cautiously, as if expecting it to be snatched away. Each movement revealed both strength and the telltale signs of someone accustomed to making herself small despite her size. A contradiction that spoke volumes about the life she must have led. "Why?" she asked between careful bites. "Why did you cut me down?" Elias looked away, his weathered face unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "I've seen too many left to die, made a promise I wouldn't let it happen again if I could help it." In the silence that followed, the weight of unspoken histories hung between them, like the dust in the air. "He sold me to them," Sarah finally said, her voice growing stronger, "to Rollins and his men. Said I was collateral for a debt." Elias frowned. "Rollins?" "Raymond Rollins works for Judge Harlan in town." Her fingers traced the rope burn on her neck. "They've been after Kane for months. Money, I think. When they came yesterday, Kane offered me instead. Called me a curiosity they could sell to a traveling show." She looked up, her gaze direct despite the humiliation evident in her voice. "When Rollins said that wasn't enough, Kane put the rope around my neck himself. Said I wasn't fully human anyway, so it wasn't murder." The coldness in Elias's gut hardened into something sharper. "And they left you hanging to die slow." Sarah nodded. "Rollins said they'd come back today to collect my body. Said it would serve as a warning to others who tried to cheat them." Elias stood, moving to the window where the fading light cast long shadows across the yard. The hanging rope still swayed gently in the evening breeze, a grim reminder of what he had interrupted. "I worked this land for 10 years, Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "Built the barn with my own hands. Dug the well when the old one ran dry." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Kane said it was my home too. Seems he had other ideas." Elias turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "How did you come to work for Kane in the first place?" Sarah's eyes grew distant. "My parents were Swedish immigrants, came to Wyoming territory when I was small. I was different from birth. The doctor said something was wrong with my throat, my neck." She gestured to the base of her throat. "Made me grow too tall, too strong. People in town called me names, said I was touched by the devil." She swallowed hard. "When fever took my family, no one would take me in. I was 17 alone. Kane found me working at a farm near Laramie. Offered me a place here, said my size was a gift for farm work." Her voice hardened. "Later I learned he'd filed papers saying I was his property. Claimed I wasn't fully human, so the emancipation didn't apply." Elias's jaw tightened. He had heard of such things. Legal loopholes exploited by those unwilling to accept the end of an era. Those papers wouldn't stand in any proper court. "There's no proper court for someone like me out here," Sarah replied simply. Before Elias could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats cut through the evening stillness. Sarah tensed her eyes wide with renewed fear. "Rollins," she whispered. "He's come back." Elias moved quickly to the window, peering out at the road leading to the farm. In the fading light, he could make out the flicker of torches, still distant, but drawing steadily closer. "How many men does he usually bring?" he asked, his voice calm, despite the tension evident in his posture. "4, sometimes 5, Sarah replied, struggling to rise from the mattress. "You should go. This isn't your fight." "Stay down," Elias ordered, his tone brooking no argument. He moved to his saddlebags, which he had dropped by the door, and extracted a worn leather pouch. From it, he pulled a Colt Army revolver, checking the chambers with practiced efficiency before tucking it into his belt. "This is my property now," he said, retrieving his Springfield rifle next. "Paid for with every dollar I had to my name. If Rollins has business here, he can discuss it with me." Sarah stared at him, disbelief warring with hope in her expression. "You don't understand what these men are capable of." Elias's eyes met hers, and for a moment the hardened soldier who had survived the bloodiest battles of the war was visible beneath the aging exterior of the man who had sought only peace. "I understand exactly what men are capable of," he replied softly. "Now stay out of sight." He extinguished the oil lamp with a quick breath, plunging the house into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of twilight through the windows. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by the jingle of spurs and the murmur of voices. Elias positioned himself by the window Springfield at the ready, his breathing steady and controlled. The cold calculation of combat settled over him like a familiar coat, one he had hoped never to wear again, yet fit him as perfectly as it had 14 years ago. Outside, 5 riders emerged from the growing darkness, torches held high as they approached the yard. At their lead rode a tall, gaunt man with a thick beard and a long scar running from his right eye to the corner of his mouth. His black duster caught the torchlight as he reined his horse to a stop before the hanging rope, now empty, save for the severed end still dangling from the branch. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "Seems our message has been tampered with." He scanned the property, eyes narrowing as they settled on the farmhouse where a faint movement at the window betrayed Elias's presence. "Elias Creed," the man called out the use of his name, sending a chill down Elias's spine. "I know you're in there. Come on out so we can have a civilized conversation." How did he know his name? Elias remained silent, mind racing. If they knew who he was, then this was no chance encounter. Something deeper was at play. "Don't make this difficult, Creed," the man continued. "We've got business to discuss about property that rightfully belongs to Judge Harland." Elias felt Sarah's presence behind him, her breathing shallow with fear, despite her attempt to remain silent. "That's Rollins," she confirmed in a whisper. "The one with the scar." Elias nodded, his decision made. Keeping the rifle ready but lowered, he moved to the door. "Stay back," he murmured to Sarah. "If things go wrong, there's a trap door under the rug in the corner. Root cellar. Hide there." Before she could protest, he opened the door and stepped onto the porch. His posture relaxed but alert, the rifle held casually but ready to be raised in an instant. "This is private property," Elias called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. "State your business." Rollins smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Ah, there you are, Captain Creed. Or is it just Mr. these days?" He gestured to the empty hanging rope. "I see you've been making yourself at home. Found our little welcome gift, did you?" "I found a woman being murdered on my land," Elias replied, his expression impassive. "Decided to object to that." A chuckle rippled through the mounted men, though there was no humor in the sound. "Your land," Rollins repeated, emphasizing the word with mocking incredulity. "Now that's where we seem to have a misunderstanding." He reached into his duster and pulled out a folded document. "You see, Samuel Kane pledged this property as collateral against a significant debt owed to Judge Harland, a debt that remains unpaid." "I have a deed of sale," Elias countered evenly, "signed by Kane and witnessed by the territorial court." Rollins's smile widened. "Oh, I'm sure you do. Kane was always good at producing paperwork when it suited him. But out here, Captain Court papers don't mean a damn thing." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the hard-packed earth. "The only law that matters is whose gun speaks louder." The riders spread out slightly, a subtle but unmistakable threat. Elias noted their positions with the tactical eye of a veteran, cataloging weapons distances and the quickest path to cover if shooting started. "What is it you want?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Well, now that's simple," Rollins replied. "Either you pay Kane's debt, $5,000, or you turn over the Swedish freak Kane used as partial payment. Or if you're feeling particularly stubborn, we can just kill you and take both." $5,000, more money than Elias had seen in years, more than most men would earn in a lifetime of honest work. "And if I refuse all 3 options," Elias asked, his finger resting lightly alongside the trigger guard of his rifle, Rollins's scarred face hardened. Then we burn this place to the ground, with you in it. He paused, then added with mock reasonableness, but I'm a reasonable man, so I'll give you time to consider. 7 days, Creed. He held up 7 fingers as if speaking to a child. Either pay up or hand over the woman. He leaned forward in his saddle. And if you're thinking of running, know that there's nowhere in the territory you can hide where we won't find you. With that, Rollins yanked the reins, turning his horse. 7 days, he repeated, and just so you know, that freak isn't human. Kane had papers declaring her a rare specimen, property like any mule or ox. You've got no moral high ground to stand on. The riders turned as one and spurred their horses, disappearing into the gathering darkness as quickly as had come. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Elias lower his rifle, his knuckles white around the wooden stock. Behind him, the door creaked open. Sarah stood framed in the doorway, her towering figure silhouetted against the faint light from within. "You should have let me hang," she said quietly. "Now they'll kill you too." Elias turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "They'll try," he replied. Inside, Elias relit the oil lamp, its warm glow chasing away the shadows, but not the tension that filled the small farmhouse. Sarah sat at the wooden table, her large frame making the chair beneath her seem child-sized. "How did they know your name?" she asked. Elias set his rifle against the wall and sank into the chair opposite her. "That's what I'd like to know." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "Seems Kane's deception runs deeper than I thought." "What will you do?" Sarah's eyes, still red from the rope's constriction, searched his face. "You can't pay them, and they won't stop coming." Elias was silent for a long moment, weighing options in the methodical way that had kept him alive through years of war and its aftermath. "Tell me everything you know about Rollins, Judge Harlan, and their connection to Kane." Sarah straightened slightly. "Judge Howard Harlan is the most powerful man in redemption, owns the bank, controls the court. After the war, he started gathering other former Confederate officers around him. Men like Rollins." She paused. "They call themselves the Reconstruction Association, but most folks just know them as the Judge's Men." Elias's eyes narrowed at the mention of Confederate officers. Sarah continued, "Kane came here about 12 years ago, always boasted of his connections back east. But I think he was running from something." She hesitated, then continued. "Last winter, Rollins started coming around demanding payments. Kane would disappear for days, come back with just enough money to hold them off. But this time," her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, "this time he decided I was worth more to him as payment than as labor." Elias absorbed this information, his mind constructing a picture of the forces aligned against them. "Do you know how much Kane owed exactly?" Sarah shook her head. "He never said, but I found papers once hidden in a box under a floorboard in his room. Bank notes, letters with threats, thousands of dollars at least." Elias stood and began to pace the floorboards, creaking beneath his weight. $5,000, he muttered. "Might as well be asking for the moon." "You could leave," Sarah suggested again. "Tonight, take what supplies you can carry and go. This land isn't worth dying for." Elias stopped, turning to face her with an intensity that made her straighten instinctively. "This land is all I have left," he said quietly. "Every dollar, every favor, every promise I could call in went into buying it. There's nowhere left for me to go." His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where a folded daguerreotype rested in his inner pocket. The only image he had of Elizabeth and Mary taken before he had ridden off to war. "Besides," he added, his voice softening slightly, "if I left, what would happen to you?" Sarah looked away, her expression a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. "Why do you care? I'm nothing to you, just a burden Kane left behind." Elias resumed his seat at the table. "Let me tell you a story, Miss Nordstrom. During the war at Gettysburg, my company was captured after Pickett's charge failed. The Union soldiers were supposed to take us as prisoners, follow the rules of war." His eyes grew distant with the memory. "Instead, their commander, a man I had actually shared drinks with before the war, ordered my men hanged as traitors." He swallowed hard. "I watched 19 good men die that day, strung up from an oak tree, not unlike the one in the yard. I survived only because a Union sergeant recognized me as the man who had spared his brother at Antietam." He refocused on Sarah. "When I returned home to Richmond after the surrender, I found my wife and daughter had died of typhoid months earlier. While I was fighting for a cause that was already lost, they died alone. The pain in his voice, though controlled, was palpable. I made a promise then, to my daughter's memory, to whatever God might still be listening, that I would never again stand by while someone suffered if I could prevent it. Sarah's expression softened. I'm sorry about your family. Elias acknowledged her sympathy with a nod. So you see, Miss Nordstrom, this isn't just about the land or the money. It's about keeping the only promise I have left that means anything. In the silence that followed, the weight of their shared predicament settled between them. Two broken souls thrown together by circumstance and the machinations of a man who had used them both. What can we do against men like Rollins and Judge Harlan? Sarah finally asked. They own the law here. Elias's jaw set with determination. First, we need to understand exactly what we're facing. Tomorrow, I'll ride into Redemption, see what I can learn about Kane's debt and these so-called property papers he filed on you. They'll recognize you, Sarah warned. It's too dangerous. Hiding won't solve anything, Elias countered. Besides, if what Rollins says is true, the judge already knows who I am. Better to face this head on. He stood moving to the window to scan the darkness outside. Tonight we'll take turns keeping watch. I don't think they'll return so soon, but better safe than sorry. Sarah rose as well, her height all the more impressive as she stood to her full stature. I can take the first watch. I don't need much sleep. Elias studied her for a moment, noting the determination that had replaced the despair in her eyes. Whatever Sarah Nordstrom was, and he was certain she was fully human regardless of Kane's paperwork, she was no coward. All right, he agreed. Wake me at midnight. He hesitated, then added more gently, and Sarah, thank you for telling me the truth. Not many would have been so forthright with a stranger. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You cut me down when you could have ridden away. That makes you different from most men I've known. As Sarah took her position by the window rifle in hand, Elias stretched out on the worn couch across the room. Sleep would not come easily, but he needed to rest. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and he would need his wits about him to navigate the dangerous waters of redemption. Just before exhaustion claimed him, Elias's thoughts drifted to the empty hanging rope in the yard. It stood as a grim reminder of how quickly life could be snatched away, and how thin the line between justice and cruelty had become in this harsh land. 7 days. 7 days to find a solution or prepare for war. Dawn broke over Redemption like a hesitant apology, pale light seeping between the buildings that lined its single main street. Elias Creed tied Sadi to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He had left Sarah at the farm with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the Springfield rifle close. The town was just beginning to stir, a shopkeeper sweeping his porch, a pair of women carrying laundry baskets toward the creek, a drunk sleeping off the previous night in the alley beside the Prairie Rose Saloon. Ordinary scenes that somehow felt like an elaborate stage play, a veneer of normalcy stretched thin over something rotten beneath. Elias adjusted his worn cavalry hat, hiding the gray in his hair and shadowing his eyes. He wore no gun, openly a calculated risk. Walking into town armed would draw attention. Coming unarmed would make him vulnerable. The compromise was the derringer tucked into his boot and the knife sheathed against the small of his back. The sheriff's office was a squat, sturdy building of red brick with barred windows and a hand-painted sign that had faded under years of sun and dust. Elias pushed open the door, wincing at the creak of hinges that badly needed oil. Inside the office was sparse but neat. Wanted posters lined one wall, a gun rack stood behind the desk, and 2 cells with iron bars occupied the back. Both were empty. Behind the desk sat a man who seemed as weathered as the building itself. Thin white hair combed across a sun-spotted scalp, a mustache yellowed by tobacco, and eyes that retained the sharp alertness of a predator despite the aging body that housed them. "Help you?" the man asked, not rising from his chair. "Looking for Sheriff Miller," Elias replied, remaining near the door. "Found him." The sheriff's gaze sharpened, taking in Elias's appearance with a lawman's practiced assessment. "You're new to Redemption." It wasn't a question. Elias Creed bought the old Kane property west of town. Something flickered in Miller's expression, recognition perhaps or concern. "Heard about that. Didn't expect to see the new owner so soon." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What brings you to my office, Mr. Creed?" Elias took the offered seat, his posture relaxed but alert. "Hoping you might shed some light on a situation I've inherited, along with the property." Miller leaned back his chair, creaking in protest. "Let me guess. Visitors last night, tall fellow with a beard and a scar, mentioned something about money owed to Judge Harland." Elias's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're well-informed, Sheriff." A humorless smile crossed Miller's face. "It's a pattern around here. Kane's pulled the same trick 3 times in the past 2 years. Sells property he's already pledged as collateral pockets, the money disappears. Buyer thinks they've got a deal until Rollins shows up. And you've done nothing to stop it." Elias couldn't keep the edge from his voice. Miller's eyes hardened. "You a lawman, mister. Creed ever tried enforcing the law when the judge, the bank, and half the business owners in town are aligned against you?" He leaned forward. "I've got a wife and 3 grandchildren in this town. I pick my battles carefully." Elias studied the older man, recognizing the careful calculation of a survivor. "Tell me about Judge Harlan and Raymond Rollins." Miller glanced at the door, then lowered his voice. "Judge Howard Harlan arrived here 10 years ago, right after the war. Distinguished record in the Confederate Army, or so he claims." The sheriff's emphasis suggested doubt. "Started buying up land businesses. Now he owns the bank, the largest cattle ranch in the county, and has the territorial court in his pocket." He continued, his voice dropping further. "And Rollins has enforced a former lieutenant in the Virginia Cavalry. Mean as a rattlesnake and twice as dangerous. Handles problems that can't be solved with legal papers." Miller's expression darkened. "6 men have died by Rollins's hand since I've been sheriff, all ruled justified by the judge's court." Elias absorbed this information, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "What about the woman at Kane's farm, Sarah Nordstrom?" Miller's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The Swedish giant, she's still there." He let out a low whistle. "Thought Kane would have taken her when he ran. She's been his property for years, though how a human being can be property after the emancipation is beyond me." "She's not property," Elias said, his voice tight. "Kane tried to hang her before he left. I cut her down." The sheriff stared at him, shock giving way to a newfound respect. "Well now, that explains Rollins's interest in you." He shook his head. "Kane must have promised her to Harland as part of his debt settlement. So I'm discovering—" Elias leaned forward. "What can you tell me about these so-called papers Kane filed declaring her non-human property?" Miller snorted. "Legal fiction. Kane bribed a doctor to claim she had some rare medical condition that made her less than human. Presented it to a friendly judge in Wyoming before bringing her here." He spread his hands in a gesture of futility. "It wouldn't stand up in any proper court, but out here." The implication was clear. "And if you wanted to challenge those papers, you'd need to petition the territorial court in Denver." Miller's expression made it clear what he thought of those chances, which is a 3-week ride, assuming Rollins let you leave town alive. Elias fell silent, weighing options that seemed increasingly limited. "Why did you buy that property, Mr. Creed?" Miller asked suddenly. "Man like you, I can see the soldier in your bearing could have settled anywhere." Elias met the sheriff's gaze. "Wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere to put the war behind me." Miller nodded slowly. "Well, you found the opposite, I'm afraid. Harlan and his Reconstruction Association have been building power here for years. They don't take kindly to losing what they consider theirs." "Reconstruction Association," Elias echoed. "That's what they call themselves officially. Band of former Confederate officers with dreams of restoring proper order." Miller lowered his voice further. "They've been buying up land all through the territory, intimidating settlers, especially those who fought for the Union or who aren't the right kind of white." The implications settled over Elias like a shroud. Not just corrupt businessmen then, but ideologues with a cause, perhaps the most dangerous enemies of all. $5,000, Elias said. "That's what Rollins claims Kane owes." Miller whistled low. "That's steep even for Kane. Must have been desperate this time." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Is there anyone in town who might know more about Kane's dealings? Someone at the bank, perhaps?" The sheriff considered this. "Bank manager is Harlan's nephew. Won't help you." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "But Martha Henderson, the senior teller, been there 30 years since before Harlan arrived. Tough old bird. Might know something if she's willing to talk." Elias stood extending his hand. Thank you, Sheriff. You've been more helpful than I expected. Miller shook the offered hand, his grip still firm despite his age. Word of advice, Mr. Creed. Whatever you decide to do, do it quickly. Rollins isn't known for his patience, 7 days notwithstanding. As Elias reached the door, Miller called after him. And watch yourself at the bank. Walls have ears in this town. The First Bank of Redemption occupied the most imposing building on Main Street, 2 stories of red brick with white columns flanking the entrance, an ostentatious display of prosperity in a town where most buildings were weathered wood. Elias climbed the steps slowly, noting the armed guard who stood at attention beside the entrance, his eyes tracking Elias's approach with open suspicion. Inside, the bank's interior was cool and quiet, the hushed atmosphere of wealth a stark contrast to the dusty street outside. 3 teller windows lined the far wall, only one currently occupied by a young man whose starched collar seemed to be slowly choking him. To the right, a door marked Thomas Harlan, Manager, stood closed. To the left, a heavy iron safe dominated the corner, its polished surface gleaming in the light from the high windows. At the occupied window, Elias waited patiently as the teller finished counting coins for a weathered farmer. May I help you, sir? The young man asked when Elias stepped forward, his tone carrying the careful deference of someone trained to judge a customer's worth by appearance. I need information about a loan made to Samuel Kane, Elias said directly. I've purchased his property and discovered there may be liens against it. The teller's eyes widened slightly. I'm not authorized to discuss customer accounts, sir. Perhaps if you spoke with Mr. Harlan. Is Mrs. Henderson available? Elias interrupted, recalling the sheriff's suggestion. Something like alarm flashed across the young man's face. Mrs. Henderson is occupied with the monthly reconciliation. If you'll wait here, I'll inform Mr. Harlan of your inquiry. Before Elias could object, the teller disappeared through a side door. Through the frosted glass of the manager's office, Elias could see shadows moving, voices too low to make out the words, but the urgency clear in their tone. Instead of waiting, Elias moved to the third teller window where an elderly woman had appeared. Her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a narrow nose. She was sorting papers with the efficiency of long practice, seemingly oblivious to his presence. Mrs. Henderson, Elias ventured. The woman looked up, her sharp eyes assessing him over the rims of her spectacles. Yes. My name is Elias Creed. I purchased Samuel Kane's property and... I know who you are, Mr. Creed, she interrupted, her voice low but clear. Word travels fast in redemption. She glanced toward the manager's office, then slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. I believe this might address your concerns. Puzzled, Elias took the paper, tucking it into his pocket without examining it. The church bell rings at 3, Mrs. Henderson said cryptically, then raised her voice to a normal volume. I'm afraid I cannot help you with account information, sir. Bank policy. You'll need to speak with Mr. Harlan. As if on cue, the manager's door opened and a young man in an immaculate suit emerged. Thomas Harlan bore a striking resemblance to what must have been a younger version of the judge. The same patrician features, the same cold eyes, but lacking the gravitas that age and experience confer. Mr. Creed, I presume, he said, approaching with a smile that never reached his eyes. I understand you have questions about the Kane property. If you'll join me in my office. Elias glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who had returned to her papers with studied concentration. Another time, perhaps. I have other business in town today. Harlan's smile tightened. I strongly recommend we discuss this matter now, Mr. Creed. There seemed to be some misunderstandings regarding that property. No misunderstanding, Elias replied evenly. I have a deed of sale properly filed. If there are other claims against the property, they should have been disclosed at the time of sale. Yes, well, my uncle, that is Judge Harlan, holds certain financial instruments related to that land. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that satisfies all parties. I look forward to that discussion, Elias said, moving toward the door, after I've had a chance to review all the relevant documents. Thomas Harlan's facade of politeness cracked slightly. Mr. Creed, I must insist. Good day, Mr. Harlan. Elias cut him off, tipping his hat before stepping out into the sunlight. He could feel eyes on him as he walked down the street, from the bank, from the windows of the general store, from the porch of the hotel, where two well-dressed men interrupted their conversation to watch his progress. The sensation was familiar from his days as a scout, the awareness of being marked targeted. Only when he reached the relative privacy of the alley beside the livery stable did Elias withdraw the paper Mrs. Henderson had given him. The note was brief, written in a neat, precise hand. Meet me at the church at 300. Come alone. What you seek is not in the bank records. Elias checked his pocket watch nearly noon. 3 hours to wait, and every instinct warned him that lingering in town was dangerous. He needed supplies information and to check on Sarah, but showing too much interest in any of these things could alert Harlan's men to his intentions. The church bell tolled the hour, its resonant chime carrying across the town square. Elias approached the weathered white clapboard building from the rear, taking a circuitous route that allowed him to confirm he wasn't being followed. The church stood slightly apart from the other buildings in town, bordered by a small cemetery where tilting headstones recorded the brief history of redemption and its inhabitants. Inside the church was cool and dim light filtering through simple stained glass windows that depicted scenes from the New Testament. The sanctuary was empty, save for an elderly man in clerical attire polishing the wooden pulpit, and Mrs. Henderson, who sat in the last pew with her hands folded primly in her lap. The clergyman looked up as Elias entered, nodding in acknowledgement. "Welcome to God's house, stranger," he said quietly. "I'm Pastor Collins." "He's with me, Pastor," Mrs. Henderson said, rising. "We'll use the study if you don't mind." "Of course, Martha." The pastor's kind eyes belied a shrewdness as they assessed Elias. "The Lord brings us allies in unexpected forms, doesn't he?" Before Elias could respond to this cryptic comment, Mrs. Henderson gestured for him to follow her through a side door into a small, book-lined room that smelled of leather paper and pipe tobacco. "We can speak freely here," she said, closing the door behind them. "The pastor is one of the few in town not under Harlan's thumb." "Why are you helping me, Mrs. Henderson?" Elias asked directly. "You're taking a considerable risk." The elderly woman's expression hardened. "Because Samuel Kane isn't the first person Harlan and his associates have destroyed, and you won't be the last if someone doesn't stand against them." She moved to a worn leather chair, gesturing for Elias to take its companion. "My son fought and died for the Union, Mr. Creed. I will not stand by while men like Harlan try to resurrect the very ideology he gave his life to defeat." Elias sat studying this unexpected ally. "Tell me about Kane's debt to Harlan." "It's not just debt," Mrs. Henderson replied. "It's much worse than that. Kane was part of Harlan's inner circle, the Reconstruction Association, former Confederate officers and sympathizers with dreams of restoring the natural order, as they call it. Sheriff Miller mentioned the association. Did he tell you what they really are? What they plan?" When Elias shook his head, she continued, her voice lowered despite their privacy. "They're building a political power base, Mr. Creed. Buying land, controlling commerce, intimidating opposition. Harlan has ambitions far beyond being a small-town judge. He's positioning himself for territorial office with an eye towards statehood." "What does this have to do with Kane and my property?" "Everything." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward intently. "The association has been systematically acquiring properties along the proposed railroad route. Your land, Kane's former property, sits at a critical juncture where the line must pass. Harlan needs it for his plans to succeed." The pieces began to fall into place. "So Kane was working with Harlan, not against him." "Initially, yes, but Kane has a weakness for gambling and women. He began embezzling from association funds to cover his debts. When Harlan discovered the theft, Kane fled, but not before selling the farm to you as a final betrayal." "And Sarah Nordstrom, where does she fit into this?" Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "The Swedish woman, she was Kane's project. He collected oddities, a man of perverse intellectual curiosity. He claimed to be conducting scientific observations on her condition, but in truth he simply enjoyed the power of owning another human being." Disgust churned in Elias's stomach. "Sheriff Miller mentioned medical papers declaring her non-human. Fabrications, all of it. Kane bribed a disgraced doctor to create a medical history, claiming her condition rendered her a different species. It's nonsense, of course, but it provided a legal fiction that allowed him to circumvent emancipation laws. And Harlan supported this. Harlan supports anything that reinforces the hierarchy he believes in: white men of property at the top, everyone else beneath. Some so far beneath they're not considered fully human." She sighed heavily. When Cain's embezzlement was discovered, offering Sarah to Harlan was his attempt at appeasement. Harlan has unusual tastes in entertainment. The hanging was likely Cain's idea of a dramatic farewell. The thought of what might have happened to Sarah had he not arrived when he did sent a cold rage through Elias. What about the $5,000 Rollins demanded? That would be the amount Cain stole plus Harlan's interest. But it's not really about the money, Mr. Creed. It's about control. Harlan needs that land, and he needs to make an example of anyone who defies him. So paying would be pointless. Precisely. He'd find another reason to come after you. Mrs. Henderson reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded document. This is what you really need to see. Elias accepted the paper, unfolding it carefully. It was a map of the county with certain properties marked in red ink. His farm was circled prominently along with a dozen others, forming a clear path from the eastern rail junction to the mountain pass in the west. The association's acquisition targets, Mrs. Henderson explained. I copied this from Harlan's private files. He keeps the originals in a safe at his home. Elias studied the map with a tactician's eye. This is valuable intelligence, Mrs. Henderson, but it doesn't solve my immediate problem. Rollins gave me 7 days to pay or surrender Sarah. That deadline doesn't leave much time for legal maneuvering. Chewing, the law won't help you here, Mr. Creed. Harlan is the law in redemption. She hesitated, then added more gently, if you're wise, you'll leave tonight. Take the woman and go. There are places beyond Harlan's reach. Elias carefully refolded the map. I appreciate your candor, Mrs. Henderson, but running isn't an option. That farm represents everything I have left. A sad smile touched her lips. I suspected you might say that. You have the look of a man who stood his ground before. Once or twice, Elias acknowledged with grim humor. The church bell chimed the half hour, startling them both. I should return to the bank before my absence is noted, Mrs. Henderson said, rising. Pastor Collins can show you out through the cemetery. Less chance of being observed that way. As they returned to the sanctuary, they found the pastor in conversation with a newcomer, a stocky man in his 50s with calloused hands and the weathered complexion of someone who worked outdoors. He fell silent as they approached, eyeing Elias warily. Martha, Mr. Creed, Pastor Collins said. This is Michael Donovan. He farms north of town and shares our concerns about the association's activities. Donovan nodded curtly. Heard you bought Cain's place. Brave or foolish, depending on how you look at it. Mr. Donovan, Mrs. Henderson said, would you be kind enough to escort me back to the bank? I find I'm in need of a strong arm this afternoon. The farmer offered his arm with unexpected gallantry. Of course, Martha. As they departed, Pastor Collins gestured for Elias to follow him toward the rear of the church. Mr. Donovan isn't the only one watching Harlan's activities with concern, he said quietly. There are others in the community who resist the association's influence. Small farmers mostly. People with little power individually, but who might stand together if given leadership. I'm not looking to lead a resistance, Pastor, Elias said. I just want to keep my farm and ensure Sarah Nordstrom's safety. The clergyman smiled sadly. Sometimes God places us exactly where we're needed, Mr. Creed, regardless of our own plans. He opened a door that led to the cemetery. There's a path through those trees that will take you to the livery stable without being seen from the main street. Go with God, my friend. Elias nodded his thanks and slipped out into the graveyard, moving swiftly between the headstones. As he reached the tree line, movement at the church's front entrance caught his attention. 3 riders had arrived, Rollins among them, dismounting with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to deference. Ducking into the shadows of the pines, Elias circled back, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. Through the open church door, he could see Rollins confronting Pastor Collins, their voices too distant to make out the words, but the aggressive posture unmistakable. The pastor stood his ground, one hand resting on his Bible, his expression serene despite the threat looming before him. After a tense exchange, Rollins spat on the church steps, then remounted and rode off with his companions. Elias waited until they were well away before continuing to the livery stable. Whatever Pastor Collins had said, it had clearly angered Rollins, which suggested the clergyman might indeed be a potential ally worth cultivating. The ride back to the farm was tense, Elias constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit or ambush. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dusty trail into a shimmer of heat and light that played tricks on the eyes. Twice he detoured from the main path, using the terrain to mask his progress and while checking for followers. As the farm came into view, relief washed over him at the sight of smoke rising from the chimney, a sign that Sarah was still there, still alive. He had half expected to return to smoldering ruins, given what he now knew about Harlan's determination to acquire the property. Sarah emerged from the house as he approached, the Springfield rifle held competently in her large hands. She lowered it only when she was certain of his identity. "You're back," she said, the simple statement carrying a wealth of relief. "I was beginning to worry." Elias dismounted, leading Sadi toward the barn. "Any trouble while I was gone?" "No visitors, if that's what you mean." Sarah fell into step beside him. "But I found something you should see." Inside the barn, Sarah led him to what appeared to be a solid wall at the back of the largest stall. "I was mucking out the stalls, seemed the least I could do, and noticed the flooring didn't match." She knelt, her strong fingers prying at a section of the wooden floor. It lifted, revealing a trap door. "There's a cellar underneath, and it's not empty." Elias crouched beside her, peering into the darkness below. "Did you go down?" Sarah nodded. "It's Kane's hiding place. There are crates, papers, and weapons, Mr. Creed. Lots of weapons." The hidden cellar was larger than Elias had expected, extending well beyond the barn's footprint. Sarah lit a lantern on, illuminating a space that had clearly been used as a secret storehouse for some time. Wooden crates were stacked against one wall, many bearing military markings. A desk cluttered with papers occupied the center of the room, and a gun rack holding a dozen rifles stood opposite the crates. "This is more than personal storage," Elias muttered, examining one of the crates. Inside were ammunition boxes, standard military issue, the kind he had requisitioned countless times during the war. "This is a supply depot." Sarah watched as he moved methodically through the space, cataloging its contents. "For Harlan's association, so on." "Appears so." Elias opened another crate, finding it filled with revolvers packed in oiled cloth. "Enough weapons here to arm 20 men, maybe more." "There's something else," Sarah said, moving to the desk. "Letters, records." Kane kept detailed notes on the association's activities, including this. She handed him a leather-bound ledger. Elias opened the book, finding page after page of meticulous entries, names, dates, amounts. Financial records, he realized, showing who contributed to the association, where the money went. He flipped to the later pages where the neat columns gave way to increasingly desperate notations in Kane's hand, evidence of his embezzlement. "Is it enough to prove what Harlan is doing to get help from the territorial authorities?" Sarah asked. "Maybe," Elias said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But Denver is weeks away, and Rollins will move long before we could return with a marshal." He closed the ledger, tucking it into a saddlebag. "Still, this gives us leverage we didn't have before." He continued searching the cellar, finding maps similar to the one Mrs. Henderson had shown him, correspondence between Harlan and various officials, and most damning of all, detailed plans for intimidating homesteaders who refused to sell their land. Kane was Harlan's record keeper, Elias realized. Probably why he got away with the embezzlement for so long. He controlled the books. "And why Harlan wants this land back so badly," Sarah added. "He must know these records are here, or suspect at least." Elias selected several of the most incriminating documents, adding them to his saddlebag. "We should move these somewhere safer. If Rollins comes with force, this would be the first place they'd search." They spent the next hour transferring the most valuable documents to a new hiding place beneath the floorboards in the house, then concealing the entrance to the cellar as carefully as they could. By the time they finished, dusk was settling over the farm, painting the landscape in shades of purple and gold. Inside the house, Elias spread the documents on the table, organizing them by type and relevance. Sarah prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beans, moving around the kitchen with surprising grace despite her size. "What did you learn in town?" she asked as they ate. Elias recounted his conversations with Sheriff Miller, Mrs. Henderson, and Pastor Collins, watching Sarah's expression shift from concern to anger and finally to resigned understanding. "So it's as I feared," she said when he finished. "Harlan won't be satisfied with money or even with me. He wants the land and will use any pretext to take it." "Yes," Elias agreed grimly, "but now we know why, and knowledge is power." "What power do we have against men like Harlan and Rollins? They control the law." The bank most of the town. Not everyone, Elias corrected. There are others who resist Miller, though cautiously. Mrs. Henderson, Pastor Collins, this farmer Donovan. Probably more we don't know about yet. You think they would help us? I think they might, given reason to believe we could succeed where others have failed. Elias tapped the pile of documents. These provide that reason evidence of corruption, conspiracy, illegal intimidation. Enough to ruin Harlan if it reached the right authorities. But as you said, Denver is weeks away. True, which means our immediate strategy must be to survive long enough to use this evidence. He fixed her with a steady gaze. Are you willing to fight for this land, Sarah? To stand with me against Rollins when he returns? Sarah straightened her full height, impressive even when seated. This land was my home for 10 years, Mr. Creed. I built that barn with my own hands, dug the well when the old one ran dry, planted every tree in the orchard. Cain may have owned the paper, but I poured my sweat and blood into this soil. Her eyes, pale blue in the lamplight, held a fierce determination. Yes, I will fight for it. Elias nodded, a plan forming in his mind. Then we have 5 days to prepare and much to do. As if in punctuation to his words, a flaming arrow suddenly crashed through the window, embedding itself in the wooden table between them. The corn husk wrapping around its shaft had been soaked in oil and flames spreading rapidly across the surface. Sarah reacted instantly, grabbing the water bucket and dousing the fire before it could spread. Elias was already at the window, Springfield in hand, scanning the darkness for the archer. A lone rider was silhouetted against the night sky at the edge of the property, too distant for an accurate shot. As Elias watched, the figure raised a hand in mocking salute, then galloped away toward town. When the rider was gone, Elias examined the arrow. A piece of paper had been wrapped around the shaft, protected from the flames by its placement. He unrolled it carefully, reading the message written in a bold, aggressive hand. This is just the beginning, Reed. Leave now or the next fire won't be so small. Sarah read the note over his shoulder, her face pale in the lamplight. They're not waiting the full 7 days. No, Elias agreed grimly. Harlan must suspect what we found. The timeline has changed. He moved to the door, checking that it was securely barred. Sleeping shifts tonight. I'll take first watch. As Sarah retreated to prepare for her turn at guard duty, Elias returned to the window, staring out at the vast darkness that surrounded the isolated farmhouse. Somewhere out there, Rollins and his men were plotting, waiting, preparing for their next move. The flaming arrow was just the opening salvo in what promised to be a relentless campaign to drive them from the land. A lesser man might have considered Mrs. Henderson's advice to flee while they still could. But as Elias checked the Springfield's action and counted his remaining ammunition, he felt a cold resolve settling over him, the same deadly focus that had carried him through the bloodiest battles of the war. He had not survived Gettysburg and the loss of everything he loved, only to be driven from the one thing he had left. Let Rollins come. This time Elias Creed would not be the one to retreat. Dawn broke on the third day with the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air. Elias and Sarah had spent the night in watchful vigilance, trading shifts at the windows, with weapons at the ready. The flaming arrow had been merely a warning, but both knew that more substantial threats would follow. Over a sparse breakfast of coffee and hardtack, Elias laid out the day's priorities. We need to fortify the house and barn, create defensive positions, escape routes if needed. Sarah nodded, her expression resolute despite the fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. I know this land better than anyone. There's a dry creek bed to the north that offers cover all the way to the foothills, and the root cellar under the kitchen connects to a tunnel that comes out behind the old oak. Elias raised an eyebrow. Cain's escape route. He was always a cautious man, paranoid even. A hint of bitter humor touched her lips. Ironic that he never used it when the time came. Elias unfolded the county map he had taken from Cain's hidden cache, studying the terrain surrounding the farm. Show me where these features are. Sarah leaned over the table, her finger tracing the contours of the land with the precision of someone who had walked every inch of it. The creek bed here, the tunnel exit here by the hanging tree. She faltered slightly at the mention of the oak where she had nearly died. There's also a ridge to the west that provides a good vantage point. Cain used it to watch for visitors. Elias marked each location, his military mind calculating distances, fields of fire, defensible positions. Good. Now we need supplies, ammunition, food, medical necessities. I'd rather not return to town, but we'll need more than what we have on hand. There's Will Cox's trading post at the crossroads, Sarah suggested. 5 miles east. Not as big as the general store in town, but he carries essentials. And he's no friend of Harlan's. The association tried to force him off his land last year. Can you manage things here while I make the trip? Should be back by midday. Sarah straightened to her full height, an imposing figure even in her simple dress. I've defended this farm from rustlers and wolves while Kane was away gambling. I can handle a few hours alone. Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded. Keep the Springfield loaded. If Rollins or his men show up, don't try to fight them alone. Use the tunnel, get to the foothills, and wait for me there. And if you don't come back, her question was practical, not fearful. Then take the ledgers and documents we found, get to Denver, and find Marshal Reynolds. He served with the Union during the war, but he's a fair man. He'll listen. The practicality of discussing his potential death should have been unsettling, but Elias found it oddly comforting. Sarah Nordstrom was not a woman who required false assurances or protection from harsh realities. She had faced the noose and survived. She would face whatever came next with the same stoic determination. The trading post was a squat, weathered building at the junction of two dirt roads, surrounded by a cluster of cottonwood trees that provided rare shade in the otherwise exposed landscape. A hand-painted sign proclaimed, "Will Cox Trading, fair prices, no credit," in faded letters. 3 horses were hitched to the rail outside, and the muted sound of conversation drifted through the open door. Elias approached cautiously, years of combat experience, making him acutely aware of potential ambush points. He secured Sadi at the far end of the hitching rail, positioned for a quick departure if needed, and adjusted his coat to ensure easy access to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. Inside the trading post was larger than it appeared from the outside shelves, stocked with everything from canned goods to tools, ammunition to fabric. The air smelled of coffee, tobacco, and leather. 3 men stood at the counter, engaged in conversation with a barrel-chested older man who Elias presumed was Cox himself. The conversation died as Elias entered, 4 pairs of eyes turning to assess the newcomer. Elias recognized the wariness in their postures, the slight shifting to reveal holstered weapons, the subtle positioning for tactical advantage. These were not ordinary farmers or townspeople. "Help you, stranger?" Will Cox asked, his tone neutral but alert. "Need supplies," Elias replied simply. "Ammunition, coffee, salt, medical necessities." One of the men, a weather-beaten individual with a scar running along his jawline, studied Elias with narrowed eyes. "You're Creed, the one who bought Kane's place." It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in these parts, especially news of someone foolish enough to challenge Judge Harlan's interests. Elias met the man's gaze steadily. "I am." The tension in the room thickened, hands drifting closer to weapons. "Michael Donovan," the scarred man introduced himself. "We met yesterday, though you might not remember. I was speaking with Pastor Collins when you arrived." Recognition flickered in Elias's memory, the stocky farmer who had escorted Mrs. Henderson back to the bank. "I remember," Donovan gestured to his companions. "This is Jacob Weber and Thomas Erickson. We farm north of town. And this is Isaiah Wilcox, who owns this establishment and also has reason to dislike the good judge and his association." Wilcox snorted. "Reason being they tried to burn me out last spring when I refused to sell. Would have succeeded if these boys hadn't shown up with buckets and rifles." The introductions didn't ease Elias's caution, but they did provide context. Mrs. Henderson mentioned there were others who resist Harlan's influence. "Few enough," Wilcox acknowledged grimly. "Most folks are either cowed or bought off, but those of us who stand against him watch each other's backs." He began gathering items from behind the counter. "What caliber ammunition do you need?" As Elias listed his requirements, the initial tension gradually eased. The men resumed their conversation, though, in more measured tones, discussing crop conditions and water rights, the ordinary concerns of farmers that nevertheless carried undercurrents of their precarious position against Harlan's expansion. "Heard you've got the Swedish woman with you," Donovan remarked as Wilcox tallied Elias's purchases. "Sarah Nordstrom." Elias's hand drifted closer to his revolver. "What of it?" "Nothing sinister," Donovan assured him, raising his palms in a placating gesture. "My wife's sister married a Swede. Good people, hard workers. Just wondering if the stories about her are true." "Depends on which stories you've heard," Elias replied cautiously. That she's built like a bear, strong as an ox, and gentle as a lamb, unless provoked. Donovan's expression softened slightly. My eldest boy took sick 2 winters back. Fever so high, the doctor gave up hope. Sarah brought a remedy, some Swedish concoction of herbs and honey. Saved his life. Elias hadn't expected this. She never mentioned it. Wouldn't I expect? Kane forbade her from interacting with neighbors after that. Claimed he didn't want her condition spreading. Donovan spat on the floor in disgust. Truth is, he didn't want people seeing her as human. Harder to treat someone as property when you've looked in their eyes and seen a soul looking back. This aligned with what Elias had observed of Sarah, her intelligence, her dignity, despite years of degradation, her fundamental decency. Kane tried to hang her before he fled, left her for dead. The statement landed like a stone in still water, ripples of shock and anger spreading through the men. Christ Almighty, Wilcox muttered, crossing himself. And she survived. I cut her down, Elias said simply. Found her still breathing when I arrived to claim the property. A heavy silence followed, broken finally by Erickson, who had remained quiet until now. Judge sent Rollins to retrieve her, didn't he? That's why you're stocking up on ammunition. Elias saw no reason to dissemble. Rollins gave me 7 days to pay Kane's supposed debt or hand over Sarah. That was 2 days ago. But last night they fired a flaming arrow into the house as a warning. I don't expect they'll wait the full week. The men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Harlan won't stop with Sarah or your farm, Donovan said finally. You've seen the map, the pattern of acquisitions. Our lands are next on his list. Elias was surprised. You know about the map? Martha Henderson showed us, Weber explained. We've been tracking the association's movements for months, trying to find a way to stop them before they control the entire county. Which brings us to why we're really here today, Donovan continued. We've been waiting for the right moment, the right ally to take a stand against Harlan. Someone with experience, courage. Someone like a former Confederate officer who knows how to fight, Erickson added pointedly. Elias stiffened. How did you, Pastor Collins, recognize the way you carry yourself? Donovan explained. Said he ministered to enough soldiers during the war to know the bearing of a commander. And Wilcox here served with the 23rd Virginia. Says he remembers stories of a Captain Creed whose company was massacred at Gettysburg. Wilcox nodded confirmation. Different regiment, but word got around. They called you the ghost captain after that. The man who survived when his entire unit was hanged as an example. The memories Elias had spent years trying to bury surged forward. The oak tree on Seminary Ridge, 19 men with ropes around their necks. The Union colonel's cold order to make an example of the rebels. The helplessness as he watched bound and beaten, unable to save his men. That was a lifetime ago. Elias said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. I'm just a farmer now. No such thing as just a farmer out here, Donovan countered. Every one of us has had to be soldier, doctor, lawman at times, but few have your training, your experience. He leaned forward intently. We're not asking you to fight our battles for us, Creed. We're offering to stand with you in yours. Because your fight and ours are the same, Weber added. If Harlan gets your land, ours are next. If he takes Sarah, who knows who else he'll claim doesn't deserve freedom. Elias considered the offer carefully. These men were not soldiers despite their determination. Farmers with rifles against Rollins and his experienced gunmen were long odds at best. And yet, what choice did he have? Alone, he and Sarah couldn't hold the farm against a determined assault. I appreciate the offer, he said finally, but I won't lead men into a fight they can't win. Rollins has at least a dozen experienced guns at his disposal. Harlan has the law on his side, corrupted as it is. We're not suggesting a direct confrontation, Donovan clarified. We need to be smarter than that. Use the evidence you found in Kane's hideout. Gather more support. Force Harlan into the open where his political ambitions make him vulnerable. Elias was taken aback. How do you know about Kane's hideout? A small smile crossed Donovan's weathered face. Sarah isn't the only one who helped neighbors when Kane wasn't looking. She showed Weber the tunnel last year when his boy got lost during a storm. Said it was a secret, but one worth sharing with those who might need it someday. The revelation shifted Elias's understanding of the situation. Sarah had built connections, a quiet network of trust despite Kane's restrictions. These weren't just concerned farmers. They were already part of a nascent resistance against Harlan's encroachment. "What exactly are you proposing?" Elias asked. "A meeting tonight," Donovan replied, "at Pastor Collins's church just after sunset. People you can trust, people with resources. Information you may influence. Martha Henderson will be there. Sheriff Miller if he can get away without arousing suspicion." "The church is neutral ground," Wilcox added. "Harlan still maintains a pretense of Christian virtue. Even Rollins won't violate its sanctuary openly." Elias weighed the risks against the potential benefits. A coalition of locals with knowledge of the terrain, the community, and Harlan's operations could be invaluable. But gathering them in one place also created a target, an opportunity for Harlan to eliminate opposition in a single stroke if he learned of the meeting. "I'll consider it," he said finally, "but Sarah stays at the farm. Too dangerous to move her now with Rollins watching the roads." "Understood," Donovan agreed. "One of us will ride by your place an hour before sunset. If you hang a lantern from the porch, we'll know you're coming and secure the route." As Elias gathered his supplies and prepared to leave, Wilcox pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. "Medicine," the trader explained quietly, "for Sarah's neck. Wounds from hanging can fester if not treated properly." The unexpected kindness caught Elias off guard. "Thank you, Pete," he managed, tucking the pouch into his saddlebag. "We look after our own out here," Wilcox said simply. About time someone looked after Sarah. The ride back to the farm was tense, Elias constantly scanning for signs of surveillance or ambush. He took a circuitous route, doubling back several times to ensure he wasn't followed. The weight of the decisions before him pressed down like the relentless sun overhead. Trust these men or stand alone, or attend the meeting or focus solely on defending the farm. Risk everything on a coordinated resistance or make a final stand on his own terms. By the time the farm came into view, Elias had reached no firm conclusion. But the sight that greeted him drove all strategic considerations temporarily from his mind. Sarah stood in the dooryard engaged in what appeared to be combat training with a pitchfork. Her movements were powerful but unrefined as she thrust and parried against an imaginary opponent, her tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Sweat darkened her simple cotton dress, and her blonde hair had come loose from its usual severe bun, streaming behind her like a battle flag. She lowered the makeshift weapon when she spotted him, embarrassment briefly crossing her features before she straightened with dignity. "Thought I should practice, just in case." Elias dismounted, leading Sadi toward the barn. "Good initiative, though a pitchfork has limitations in a gunfight." "It's what I know," she replied simply. "Cain never allowed me to touch firearms, said they weren't for creatures like me." The casual cruelty of the statement, delivered without self-pity, struck Elias anew. "Then it's time you learn it, but first, let's get these supplies inside." As they unloaded the saddlebags, Elias recounted his encounter at the trading post, watching Sarah's reaction carefully when he mentioned Donovan and the others. "Michael Donovan is a good man," she confirmed. "His son would have died without the medicine my mother taught me to make. And Jacob Weber, he brings me books, sometimes leaves them by the fence post where Cain wouldn't notice." A faint smile touched her lips. "His wife is Swedish. He thought I might like stories from the old country. They've invited us to a meeting tonight. People who stand against Harlan, planning some kind of coordinated resistance." Sarah paused in her unpacking. "Us? I suggested you stay here, safer that way." Something like disappointment flickered across her face before she nodded in acceptance. "Of course. Practical." Elias studied her for a moment. "You'd prefer to come?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "For 10 years, I've been property, a curiosity, a beast of burden. Never allowed at a table where decisions are made." She met his gaze directly. "But it's not my choice to make. This is your farm now." The simple statement carried the weight of a lifetime of having choices made for her freedoms denied. Elias felt a surge of shame at his unthinking perpetuation of the pattern. "No," he said firmly, "it's our decision. You know these people, this land better than I do. Your insights would be valuable at the meeting. And if Rollins attacks while we're both gone, we'll secure the farm as best we can. Take the most incriminating documents with us, hide the rest." Elias's expression hardened. "Besides, if this coalition can truly stand against Harlan, it's worth the risk." The decision made, they spent the afternoon preparing both for the meeting and for potential trouble in their absence. Elias showed Sarah the basics of loading and firing the Colt revolver, impressed by her quick mastery despite never having handled firearms before. They concealed the most damaging of Kane's documents in a hidden pocket Elias sewed into his coat and buried the remainder beneath the floorboards of the root cellar. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Elias found himself watching Sarah as she moved about the house, gathering the few personal items she deemed worth taking if they couldn't return. Despite her unusual height and strength, there was a grace to her movements, an economy of motion that spoke of someone accustomed to navigating a world built for smaller people. "What was it like?" he asked suddenly. "Growing up different." Sarah paused, surprised by the personal question from a man who had revealed so little of himself. "Lonely," she admitted after a moment. "Children can be cruel. Adults crueler still, though they hide it behind pity or false concern." She folded a worn shawl carefully. "But my parents never made me feel like a burden. My father built special furniture to fit my size. My mother altered clothes so I wouldn't have to wear men's garments. They sound like good people. The best." A shadow crossed her face. "After they died, I understood what a shelter they had built around me, how much they had protected me from the world's judgment." Elias nodded, thinking of his own daughter, of the world he had hoped to build for her, a world she never got to see. "And Kane, how did he find you?" "I was working at the Hansons' farm near Laramie. Good people, but struggling after losing their sons in the war. Then Kane arrived, so polished and educated." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "He offered them $50, for me a fortune, to people barely surviving. Said he was a man of science studying rare medical conditions. Promised I'd be treated well, even educated. And they agreed. They had younger children to feed." Sarah's expression showed no resentment, and Kane was convincing. He could make cruelty sound like kindness, exploitation like opportunity. "Yet you stayed with him for 10 years, never tried to escape." A complicated emotion crossed Sarah's face. "At first, I believed him, that I was being given a chance to contribute to medical knowledge, that my condition might help others like me. By the time I understood the truth, he had the papers declaring me non-human property. Where could I go? Who would believe me against a respected landowner?" She met his gaze directly. "And there were times he was not kind, but not cruel either. Allowed me books, decent food. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival." The rationalizations of the powerless, Elias thought. He had heard similar from freed slaves after the war, the complex calculations of endurance under oppression. "And then he tried to hang you." "Because I finally defied him," Sarah said quietly. "He ordered me to help bury something I didn't know what at the time. But I found papers in the package, names of people marked for intimidation or worse. I recognized Weber's name, Donovan's. Good people who had shown me kindness when they could." Her hands clenched at the memory. "I refused. First time in 10 years. Said I wouldn't be part of hurting innocent folks. And that's when he decided to sell you to Harland." Sarah nodded. "Said if I wasn't going to be useful, I could at least be profitable. When Rollins came to collect, I fought back. That's when Kane put the rope around my neck himself. Said it was fitting a beast, dying like a beast." The matter-of-fact recounting of such calculated cruelty stirred a cold rage in Elias's chest. He had seen many atrocities during the war, but there was something particularly vile about the deliberate dehumanization of someone like Sarah, whose only crime was being born different in a world that demanded conformity. "He'll pay for that," Elias said, the quiet promise carrying more weight than any shouted oath. Sarah studied him for a moment. "You said that's not what you came here for. Peace, not vengeance." "Justice isn't vengeance," Elias countered, "and sometimes peace can only be built on the foundation of justice served." Before Sarah could respond, the distant sound of an approaching rider drew their attention. Elias moved to the window, rifle ready, while Sarah positioned herself by the door, pitchfork in hand. The rider came into view, Jacob Weber on a sturdy roan, moving at an unhurried pace that suggested a routine visit rather than urgent business. Following Donovan's instructions, Elias hung a lantern from the porch post, signaling their intent to attend the meeting. Weber acknowledged the signal with a casual tip of his hat, continuing past the farm as if simply passing by on his way elsewhere. Only someone watching closely would have noticed the subtle nod of approval, The slight adjustment of his course to create a visible trail toward a route that would not be the most direct way to the church. He's marking our path, Elias explained to Sarah, a safer road than the main trail. They waited until Weber was well away before making their final preparations. Elias saddled Saadi while Sarah gathered the last essentials into a small pack. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold that belied the tension humming in the air. "Ready?" Elias asked as Sarah emerged from the house, now dressed in sturdy trousers and a man's shirt that accommodated her frame better than her usual dresses. She nodded, pulling herself onto the sturdy draft horse they had found in Kane's stable, a massive creature that seemed designed for someone of her proportions. "As I'll ever be." They set out just as twilight began to deepen into true darkness, following Weber's subtle trail through a stand of cottonwoods, then along a dry creek bed that provided natural cover from observation. Sarah rode with surprising skill, her posture suggesting long experience in the saddle, despite Kane's restrictions. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles when Elias reined Saadi to a halt, his senses suddenly alert to danger. Sarah stopped beside him, watching his face in the gathering darkness. "What is it?" she whispered. Elias raised a hand for silence, his eyes scanning the shadowed landscape. Years of scouting had honed his awareness of the subtle signs of ambush, the unnatural stillness, the faint metallic scent of gun oil carried on the breeze, the absence of night birds that should have been calling in the brush. "Back," he murmured, turning Saadi slowly, casually, as if they had simply decided to change direction. "Don't run. Not yet." They had retreated perhaps 50 yards when the first shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dust mere inches from Saadi's hooves. Instantly, Elias spurred his mount into a gallop, Sarah following close behind on her larger horse. More shots followed, bullets whizzing past as they raced back toward the creek bed. Elias twisted in the saddle, returning fire with his revolver, aiming not for accuracy, but to force their pursuers to take cover. "The ridge," Sarah called, pointing toward a rocky outcropping that rose above the plain. "We can make a stand there." Elias nodded, understanding the tactical advantage of high ground. They veered toward the ridge, pushing their horses to their limits as the sound of pursuit grew louder behind them. They had nearly reached the base of the ridge when a shot rang out from a different direction ahead of them, not behind. Sarah's horse reared, nearly throwing her as a bullet grazed its flank. "Ambush!" Elias shouted, wheeling Saadi around to seek another escape route. But more riders emerged from the darkness, encircling them in a tightening noose of men and firearms. "That's far enough, Creed," a familiar voice called out. Raymond Rollins emerged from the shadows, his scarred face illuminated by the rising moon. "Seems you've decided to ignore my warning." Elias and Sarah pulled their horses to a stop, backs to each other, weapons ready, but hopelessly outnumbered. At least 8 riders surrounded them, rifles and revolvers trained on their position. "We have an appointment in town," Elias replied evenly. "Private business." Rollins's laugh was cold and humorless. "Oh, we know all about your appointment at the church. Did you really think you could organize against the judge without us knowing?" He gestured to one of his men. "Patterson here works for Pastor Collins, tends the grounds, hears things, like plans for secret meetings of troublemakers." The betrayal struck deep. Not Pastor Collins himself, but someone close to him, someone trusted, which meant the entire resistance network might be compromised. "What do you want, Rollins?" Elias demanded, mind racing through rapidly diminishing options. "Originally just to deliver a message, a more emphatic reminder that your deadline is approaching." Rollins's expression hardened. "But now that we know you're plotting with others against the judge's interests, I'm thinking we need to make an example. Something the rest of those farmers will remember when they consider stepping out of line." He gestured to his men, who began to close the circle tighter. "Throw down your weapons, both of you. Now." Elias calculated the odds. 8 armed men against his revolver and Sarah's untrained determination. Even if they took down several in the initial exchange, the outcome was inevitable. "If we surrender, what guarantee do we have you won't kill us anyway?" Elias asked, playing for time, seeking any advantage in the darkening landscape. "None at all," Rollins replied with brutal honesty. "But if you don't, I promise you'll die right here, right now." He aimed his revolver directly at Sarah, starting with the freak. Elias felt rather than saw Sarah tense behind him, heard the sharp intake of breath that signaled her readiness to charge, to fight, despite the hopeless odds. In that moment, he recognized in her the same quality he had seen in his best soldiers, the willingness to die on their feet, rather than live on their knees. But he had watched good men die needlessly once before. He wouldn't do so again if there was any chance of survival. Wait, Elias said, raising his free armpit in it. I have something Harlan wants. Something more valuable than the farm or Sarah. Rollins's eyes narrowed suspiciously. And what might that be? Kane's records. Detailed accounts of the association's activities, financial transactions, plans, names, dates, amounts. Elias kept his voice steady, reasonable. The kind of evidence that would interest a territorial marshal, or an ambitious politician looking to eliminate a rival. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Rollins's scarred face. You're bluffing. Am I? Elias reached slowly into his coat, telegraphing his movements to avoid being shot, and withdrew a folded document. This is just a sample. The rest are hidden where you'll never find them without my cooperation. Rollins gestured for one of his men to take the document. The writer approached cautiously, snatching the paper from Elias's hand before retreating to his boss's side. In the tense silence that followed, Rollins examined the document by the light of a match, his expression darkening as he recognized Kane's handwriting, the incriminating details of an association operation to drive a family from their homestead the previous year. Where are the rest? He demanded. Safe, Elias replied, and they'll stay that way as long as Sarah and I remain unharmed. Rollins considered this the calculations of risk and reward visible in his cold eyes. The judge will want to see these papers. He gestured with his revolver. Both of you will come with us now. Any trick, any attempt to escape, and you die slowly. Understood? Elias nodded, lowering his weapon. Behind him, he felt Sarah do the same, the fight draining from her posture. Bind them, Rollins ordered. Hands only for him. Everything for her. I know what she's capable of. As Rollins's men approached with ropes, Elias caught Sarah's eye, trying to convey reassurance. A promise that this wasn't over. She gave an almost imperceptible nod, a soldier acknowledging a commander's silent order to bide her time. The ropes bit into Elias's wrists, expertly tied to prevent escape without cutting off circulation, the work of men experienced in handling prisoners. Sarah's bonds were more extensive. Wrists and ankles secured another length of rope around her torso, pinning her arms to her sides. The giant rides with Patterson, Rollins directed. Creed with me. If either causes trouble, shoot the other one. As they were separated, mounted on different horses, Elias felt a cold certainty settle over him. They were being taken to Judge Harlan, but not to negotiate. The papers had bought them time, nothing more. Once Harlan had what he wanted, they would be disposed of quietly if the documents proved dangerous enough publicly, if an example was needed. Their only hope lay in the meeting they had been prevented from attending. If Donovan and the others realized they had been ambushed, perhaps a rescue might be attempted. But with their network potentially compromised, caution might prevail over courage. The small cavalcade set off toward town. Elias and Sarah bound and separated their horses, led by Rollins's men. Above them, the moon emerged fully from behind the clouds, illuminating the path with cold, indifferent light. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled a lonesome sound that seemed to echo the desperation of their situation. Elias fixed his gaze on Sarah's silhouette ahead of him, her tall figure proud even in captivity. He had promised her freedom protection. Now they were both prisoners, headed toward a confrontation with the architect of the oppression that had defined her life for a decade. If these were to be their final hours, he silently vowed they would not go easily into whatever fate Harlan had planned. They would find a way to escape, to fight, to expose the truth, or they would die trying with the dignity that no rope or chain could take from them. The road to redemption stretched before them, ironically named for the journey they now undertook. But as Elias had learned in war and its aftermath, redemption rarely came without blood and sacrifice. The only question was, whose blood would be shed before this night was through? Redemption emerged from the darkness like a spectral vision, windows glowing with lamplight, the silhouettes of buildings stark against the night sky. But rather than approaching the town directly, Rollins led their procession on a winding path that skirted the main streets, eventually arriving at an imposing structure set apart from the other buildings. Judge Howard Harlan's residence stood on a low hill overlooking the town, a two-story mansion of red brick and white columns that seemed transported from some southern plantation. Gas lamps illuminated a manicured lawn, and a wrought iron fence surrounded the property, symbols of wealth and authority, in a land where most still struggled for basic necessities. They were taken around to the rear entrance, away from curious eyes. Rollins dismounted, issuing curt orders to his men. Patterson, take the woman to the cellar. Mason, Richards, secure the perimeter. The rest of you disperse back to town. Check the church. See if our friends decide to hold their meeting anyway. He gripped Elias's arm, hauling him roughly from the saddle. The judge will want to speak with this one personally. Elias caught a final glimpse of Sarah as she was led away, her tall figure dwarfing the man who guided her with a gun pressed to her back. Their eyes met briefly, hers conveying not fear but a grim determination that matched his own. The interior of Harlan's mansion was a study in calculated opulence. Oriental carpets, oil paintings and gilded frames, furniture carved from rich mahogany. Every element designed to impress, to remind visitors of the vast gulf between the judge's status and their own. Rollins marched Elias through a grand hallway and into what appeared to be a study. Books lined the walls, leather-bound volumes that Elias suspected were selected more for appearance than content. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, behind which sat Judge Howard Harlan himself. The judge was older than Elias had expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. But his posture remained military straight, and his eyes, pale blue and unnervingly penetrating, held the cold calculation of a man accustomed to power and its exercise. Captain Elias Creed, Harlan said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Virginia aristocracy. Or is it just Mr.? These days, I confess, I'm uncertain of the protocol for addressing former officers of a defeated army. Something in his accent and the precise cadence of his speech stirred a distant memory in Elias, but he couldn't place it. He remained silent, assessing the man who had orchestrated so much suffering with such casual confidence. Not talkative, understandable given the circumstances. Harlan gestured to a chair opposite his desk. Please sit. Despite what you may believe, I'm not uncivilized. Your hospitality overwhelms me, Elias replied dryly, but took the offered seat. Better to conserve strength to appear cooperative while seeking any advantage. Harlan's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. Rollins tells me you've acquired some documents belonging to our mutual acquaintance Samuel Kane. I'd very much like to examine them. I imagine you would. Elias met the judge's gaze steadily. Just as I'd very much like assurances regarding my safety and that of Sarah Nordstrom. The Swedish anomaly? Harlan waved a dismissive hand. A curious specimen, but hardly worth such concern, though I understand you've developed something of an attachment to her. The casual dehumanization ignited a cold anger in Elias's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. I've developed an attachment to Justice Judge Harlan, something in short supply in your jurisdiction. Justice, Harlan repeated, as if sampling an unfamiliar delicacy. An admirable sentiment, but rather subjective. Wouldn't you agree what appears just to one man might seem tyrannical to another? He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. For instance, I consider it perfectly just to reclaim property fraudulently sold by a thief. You apparently view it as your right to retain said property, regardless of prior claims. The only thief I've encountered is Samuel Kane, Elias countered. And possibly yourself if your methods of reclaiming property are as documented in Kane's records. A flash of irritation crossed Harlan's features before his mask of civility resettled. Yes, these alleged records. Rollins showed me the sample you provided. Interesting, but hardly conclusive of anything beyond Kane's own criminality. He smiled thinly. Which is why I require the complete set. For justice, you understand. And if I refuse, then things become considerably less civilized. Harlan's smile vanished. The Swedish woman first. I understand hanging wasn't sufficient last time. Perhaps more creative measures are required. The threat hung in the air between them, its casualness more chilling than any shouted intimidation. Elias had no doubt Harlan would follow through. A man who could orchestrate the systematic oppression of an entire community would hardly balk at torturing two individuals who threatened his plans. The complete records are hidden, Elias said finally. Neither you nor Rollins would find them without my cooperation. I assumed as much. Harlan nodded as if pleased by Elias's pragmatism. Hence this conversation rather than more direct methods of persuasion. He rose, moving to a cabinet from which he extracted a crystal decanter and 2 glasses. Bourbon from Kentucky, one of the few Union contributions to civilization I have come to appreciate. When Elias didn't respond, Harlan poured a single glass and returned to his seat. I'm prepared to be reasonable, Captain Creed. Return the documents, sign the farm back over to me. I'll even pay you a nominal sum to maintain appearances, and you're free to leave my jurisdiction. The woman remains, of course, but I give you my word she won't be mistreated beyond what's necessary to ensure her cooperation. Your word, Elias echoed flatly. Like the word you gave the farmers whose land you've seized through intimidation and fraud. Like the promise of fair treatment for those who've stood against your association. Harlan sipped his bourbon, seemingly unperturbed by the accusation. Politics requires difficult decisions, Captain. The future of this territory, of this nation, hangs in the balance. His eyes took on a fervent gleam. The war may have ended on paper, but the true struggle continues. The natural order must be restored. Men of quality of breeding and vision must retake the reins of power from the mongrel democracy that has brought us to ruin. And there it was, the ideological heart of Harlan's Reconstruction Association laid bare. Not just greed or personal ambition, but a zealot's conviction in the righteousness of hierarchy, of inherent inequality. As Harlan spoke, that nagging sense of familiarity grew stronger. There was something about his mannerisms, his way of speaking, that struck a chord in Elias's memory. I fought for the Confederacy, Elias said quietly. I believed in states' rights and the primacy of local governance over federal dictates. But I never fought for slavery or for the right of men like you to determine who deserves humanity and who doesn't. A fine distinction that history won't remember, Harlan replied dismissively. The cause was larger than any individual's motivations. He leaned forward intently. You're a military man, Captain. You understand strategy, the necessity of sacrifice for the greater victory. What I build here will spread a reclamation of what was lost, a foundation for the future. A future built on extortion and murder. A future built on natural law. Harlan's voice hardened. The strong rule, the weak serve. It's the order of creation itself. Elias studied the man before him, educated, articulate, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. More dangerous than a simple tyrant driven by greed or sadism. Harlan truly believed in his cause, which made him capable of any atrocity in its service. As Harlan continued his philosophical justifications, a memory suddenly clicked into place. The voice, the cadence, the particular way he held his glass, Elias had seen it before. A chill ran down his spine as recognition dawned. I've met men like you before, Elias said, cutting across Harlan's monologue. During the war, a Union colonel captured my company after Gettysburg. He gave a speech much like yours before hanging 19 of my men from an oak tree. Called it justice, called it necessary. He believed every word just as you do. Harlan's expression flickered a momentary break in his composure. A cautionary tale, to be sure. Except it wasn't just any Union colonel, was it? Elias continued, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. It was Colonel Howard Harrison of the 12th Pennsylvania, the same man who now calls himself Judge Howard Harland. A heavy silence fell over the room. Harlan's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around his glass. You've done your research, Captain, he said finally, voice cold as ice. Or perhaps your memory serves you better than I expected. Though I must point out that Colonel Harrison died at Cold Harbor in '64 according to all official records. Convenient, Elias replied. Almost as convenient as a former Union officer reinventing himself as a Confederate sympathizer to build a power base in a territory full of displaced Southerners. Harlan or Harrison set down his glass with deliberate precision. Identity is fluid after war, Captain. Many men became someone new. You yourself traded a uniform for a plow. His eyes narrowed. Though you didn't change sides. I never betrayed what I truly believed in, Elias countered. But you were never fighting for union or abolition. You were fighting for power, for the right to decide who lives and who does. The uniform was just a means to an end. Perceptive, Harlan admitted, dropping all pretense. The war provided opportunities for men of vision, as did its aftermath. He stood moving to the window that overlooked the town. The South's cause was doomed by incompetent leadership and moral weakness, but their understanding of natural hierarchy that had merit. He turned back to Elias. I simply took what was useful from both sides. The North's industrial drive, the South's social order, the perfect foundation for the America that should be. And the people who get in your way, the farmers whose land you steal, The woman you treat as property. Acceptable losses. Harlan's tone was matter-of-fact. Every great endeavor requires sacrifice. Like the sacrifice of my men at Gettysburg. Elias's voice remained steady, but rage burned cold in his chest. 19 soldiers who had surrendered honorably, who expected the treatment guaranteed by the rules of war. An example was needed. Harlan's eyes held no remorse. And yet here you are, the sole survivor. The sergeant who recognized you, Matheson, wasn't it. He suffered an unfortunate accident shortly after that incident, too soft-hearted for war. The confirmation of what Elias had long suspected, that his savior had paid for his mercy, was the final piece of a puzzle, 14 years in the making. The man before him was directly responsible, not only for the oppression of redemption, but for the deaths that had haunted Elias's nightmares since Gettysburg. "You're a monster," Elias said quietly. "I'm a visionary," Harlan corrected. "And you, Captain, are once again my prisoner." He moved to his desk, pulling a small bell from a drawer. Dawn approaches Captain Creed. With it comes a choice. Provide the documents and accept my terms, or watch the Swedish woman hang properly this time, before meeting a similar fate yourself. And if I've ensured the documents reach the territorial authorities in the event of my death, a calculated bluff, but one that struck home. Uncertainty crossed Harlan's features momentarily. An empty threat, he decided after a pause. You've had neither time nor opportunity to send messages to Denver. Are you certain? Elias pressed the advantage. Certain enough to risk everything you've built? Your political ambitions, the association itself. Harlan's composure slipped further, a vein pulsing at his temple. Rollins, he called sharply. The door opened immediately, suggesting the enforcer had been listening just outside. Come on. Take Captain Creed to the cellar, Harlan ordered. Let him see the woman. Perhaps that will clarify his thinking. He fixed Elias with a cold stare. You have until dawn to reconsider. After that, neither of you will leave this property alive. Rollins hauled Elias to his feet, shoving him toward the door. As they left the study, Elias caught a final glimpse of Judge Harlan, the mask of civilized authority, now fully dropped, revealing the fanatic beneath. The cellar was a stark contrast to the opulence above, stone walls sweating with moisture, earth floor packed hard by years of use. A single oil lamp cast wavering shadows across the space, illuminating rows of wine racks, storage crates, and a heavy wooden support beam to which Sarah was bound. They had tied her in a standing position, arms stretched behind her, around the beam, head bowed either in exhaustion or to avoid the light that shone directly in her face, an old interrogation technique designed to disorient and intimidate. She looked up as Elias was shoved into the room, relief visible in her eyes despite the bruise darkening her left cheek. They had struck her. The knowledge kindled a slow-burning rage in Elias's chest. Touching reunion, Rollins sneered, pushing Elias toward a support post opposite Sarah. Don't get too comfortable. Dawn's only a few hours away. He secured Elias to the post with practiced efficiency, testing the bonds to ensure they were tight without cutting off circulation, the work of a man experienced in keeping prisoners alive for questioning. The judge is being generous, Rollins continued, stepping back to admire his handiwork. Giving you time to consider your options. Me, I'd have started with her fingers, worked my way up. He glanced at Sarah with clinical detachment. Wonder how much pain a freak like her can take before breaking. Why don't you untie me and find out? Sarah suggested, her voice steady despite her situation. Rollins laughed, genuinely amused. Got spirit, I'll give you that. He moved closer to her, examining her face as if appraising livestock. Shame Kane couldn't break you properly, might have saved everyone a lot of trouble. Without warning, he drove his fist into her stomach. Sarah doubled over as far as her bonds would allow, a grunt of pain escaping her lips. Leave her alone. Elias strained against his ropes, the fibers cutting into his wrists. Or what? Rollins turned to him, eyebrows raised in mock curiosity. You'll glare at me more intensely. He delivered another blow to Sarah's ribs, the impact audible in the confined space. This is just a taste of what's coming at Dawn, Creed. For both of you. He stepped back, adjusting his gloves with methodical precision. Think about that while you enjoy your last few hours. The judge wants his documents and his land. Refuse, and I get to show the Swedish giant what real pain feels like before she hangs. He moved toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom. I'll be back at first light for your answer. The door at the top of the stairs closed with a heavy thud, followed by the sound of a bolt sliding into place. For a moment, silence hung in the cellar, broken only by Sarah's labored breathing as she recovered from Rollins's assault. "Are you all right?" Elias asked, keeping his voice low in case they were being monitored. "I've had worse," Sarah replied, straightening as much as her bonds would allow. "What about you?" "Unharmed for now." He tested his bindings, finding them expertly tied, but not impossible to escape given time and determination. "Did you see anyone else when they brought you in, Miller Donovan?" Sarah shook her head. "Just Harlan's house staff. They scattered like rabbits when Rollins arrived with us." She hesitated, then added, "What did the judge want?" "Kane's documents, the farm you." Elias worked his wrists against the rope, seeking any weakness. "He offered to let me go if I surrendered everything else." "You should take the deal," Sarah said quietly. "Save yourself." Elias stopped his struggling, meeting her gaze across the dimly lit cellar. "That's not going to happen." "Why not?" "It's the rational choice." "This stopped being about the farm the moment I cut you down from that tree," Elias interrupted. "Some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed. Some principles, once compromised, can't be restored." Sarah studied him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. "You really mean that?" "I do." Elias resumed working at his bonds, his voice dropping even lower. "Which is why we're going to escape before dawn. How these ropes were tied by men who know their business. Men who are good but not perfect." Elias grimaced as he worked his right hand against the binding. "During the war, I was captured 3 times, escaped 3 times. It's a matter of patience, pain tolerance, and finding the weak point in any restraint." Sarah watched him, a new respect in her eyes. "Even if we get free of the ropes, we're locked in a cellar with no weapons in the middle of Harlan's compound." "One problem at a time," Elias muttered, feeling the rope begin to give slightly. "First the bonds, then the door, then we improvise." "You make it sound almost reasonable." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The most successful escapes often seem impossible until they're accomplished." His expression sobered. "But I won't lie to you, Sarah. The odds are long, and if we fail, we die," she finished simply. "I've faced that possibility before. At least this time I won't face it alone." Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of trust, of mutual respect, forged in shared danger. No longer merely captive and rescuer, nor reluctant allies of convenience, but partners in a desperate gambit for freedom and justice. For the next hour, they worked silently at their bonds, communicating with glances and nods when necessary. Elias made progress, first the ropes around his wrists gradually loosening as he worked them against a rough edge of the post where the wood had splintered with age. Sarah's bonds proved more challenging. Rollins had been thorough aware of her unusual strength, but she possessed an endurance that surprised even Elias, continuing to work methodically at the ropes, despite the strain on her already bruised body. "Tell me about Virginia," she said, suddenly breaking the concentrated silence. "What was it like before the war?" Elias glanced up, momentarily confused by the non sequitur. Then understanding dawned, she was creating conversation to mask the sounds of their escape efforts from anyone who might be listening at the door. "Beautiful," he replied, playing along while continuing to work at his bindings. "My family had a small farm in the Shenandoah Valley. Not grand like the big plantations, but good land. Rolling hills, forests, streams clear enough to count the pebbles at the bottom." "Sounds peaceful." It was. Memories surfaced that he had long kept buried. "My father built the house himself, added to it as the family grew. My mother planted an orchard, apples, pears, cherries. Said a home wasn't complete without fruit trees marking the seasons." "You must miss it." Elias felt the rope give further, his right hand now able to move slightly within the binding. "After the war, there was nothing left to go back to. Union troops burned the valley in '64. Scorched earth policy. The house, the barns, the orchards, all ash by the time I returned." Sarah's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Ancient history, Val," Elias deflected, uncomfortable with the direction of his own memories. "What about you? You mentioned in Sweden." "Not really. I was too young when we left, barely 4 years old. But my mother kept the traditions alive, celebrated the old holidays, cooked the foods of her childhood." A wistful smile crossed her face. "She would sing to me in Swedish every night before bed. Even when I grew too big for her to cradle, she would sit beside me and sing the same lullabies. You could go back, Elias said. After this is over, find relatives, reconnect with your roots. Sarah shook her head. America is my home for better or worse. My parents believed in the promise of this country enough to leave everything behind. I won't abandon that dream because of men like Cain and Harland. The determination in her voice struck a chord in Elias. Here was someone who had endured a decade of captivity and dehumanization, yet still believed in the fundamental promise of freedom and dignity that America represented at its best. It shamed him who had grown so cynical after the war's devastation and the broken peace that followed. A sudden realization jolted through him. That's why you stayed, he said quietly. With Cain, even when you could have run. Sarah's hands stilled their work on the ropes. What do you mean? You're strong enough to have broken free long ago, smart enough to have escaped. But you stayed because leaving meant surrendering to their definition of you property non-human, something to be feared or controlled. She was silent for a long moment, the lamplight casting shadows across her face. Perhaps, she finally acknowledged, or perhaps I simply lacked the courage to face a world that had no place for someone like me. I don't believe that, Elias said with quiet conviction. Not after seeing you stand tall when Rollins and his men surrounded us. Not after watching you endure his blows without breaking. Their eyes met across the cellar, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. The sound of the bolts sliding back shattered the moment. Both instantly resumed their positions, pretending to be securely bound as the cellar door creaked open. Footsteps descended the stairs lighter than Rollins's heavy tread, hesitant rather than confident. A figure emerged from the shadows and Elias had to suppress a sound of surprise. Martha Henderson stood at the foot of the stairs, a ring of keys in one hand and a small revolver in the other. Mrs. Henderson, Elias breathed, scarcely believing the evidence of his eyes. No time for explanations, the elderly woman whispered urgently. The household is asleep, but the guards change rotation in 20 minutes. She moved quickly to Sarah, unlocking the padlock that secured the chains, reinforcing her ropes. Can you walk? Sarah nodded. Wincing as circulation returned to her arms. Yes, Mrs. Henderson hurried to Elias next, her efficient movements belying her age. Pastor Collins and the others are waiting with horses half a mile east. When you didn't arrive at the meeting, Michael Donovan guessed what had happened. How did you get into Harlan's house? Elias asked as she freed him from the post. A grim smile touched her lips. I've worked at the bank for 30 years, Mr. Creed. I know where every key in redemption is kept, including the judge's spare set. She pressed the small revolver into his hand. Only 5 shots, I'm afraid. Make them count. Once freed, Elias helped Sarah remove the last of her bindings. Despite her assurance that she could walk, he noted how she favored her left side. Rollins's blows had done damage, though her stoicism concealed the extent. The documents, Elias remembered suddenly. Harlan will know we had help. He'll retaliate against you, against the others. Let us worry about that, Mrs. Henderson replied, leading them toward the stairs. Pastor Collins has already sent a rider to Denver with copies of the papers you showed at the trading post. Not all of Cain's records, but enough to warrant an investigation. The news was both reassuring and concerning. When did the rider leave? Yesterday afternoon. Even if Harlan sends men after him, he has a full day's head start. They reached the top of the stairs where Mrs. Henderson paused, listening intently for any sound from the main house. Satisfied, she opened the door cautiously, revealing a darkened pantry beyond. Through the kitchen, then the servants' entrance at the rear, she whispered. The eastern perimeter has only one guard tonight. Most were sent to monitor the church or patrol the town. They moved silently through the sleeping house, every creaking floorboard a potential betrayal, every shadow a possible sentry. Elias kept the revolver ready, his senses hyper-alert to any sign of discovery. The kitchen was dark save for the banked coals in the large stove casting a faint red glow that barely illuminated their path. Mrs. Henderson guided them with the confidence of someone who had memorized the layout, leading them to a narrow door that presumably opened onto the rear grounds. She paused with her hand on the latch. Once outside, stay low and follow the hedge line to the eastern fence. There's a gap where the old oak pushed the rails apart in last spring's storm. Harlan's been too preoccupied to order repairs. You're not coming with us? Sarah asked. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. My place is here. I can do more good continuing to gather information than running with you. She met Elias's gaze steadily. Besides, at my age, midnight escapades are best left to younger folks. Elias clasped her hand briefly. We'll find a way to protect you and the others when this comes to light. See that you do, she replied with surprising fierceness. Too many have suffered under Harlan's rule already. It's time it ended. She opened the door a crack, peering out into the darkness. The way is clear. Go quickly. They slipped out into the night, the cool air a welcome relief after the mustiness of the cellar. Crouching low, they made their way along the hedge line, as instructed, every sense strained for signs of pursuit or discovery. The grounds were eerily quiet, too quiet, Elias's combat instincts warned. A normal guard rotation would include occasional movement, the striking of matches, perhaps low conversation to stay alert during the monotonous night watch. This silence felt deliberate, expectant. It's too easy, he murmured as they neared the fence line. Something's wrong. Sarah nodded, her own senses clearly registering the same unnatural stillness. Trap! Before Elias could respond, the night exploded into chaos. Lanterns flared to life around them, illuminating the yard in harsh, sudden brightness. Men emerged from concealed positions, rifles and revolvers trained on their position. And stepping from behind the very oak tree that marked their escape route was Raymond Rollins, his scarred face twisted in a triumphant smile. Did you really think it would be that simple, Creed? He called, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent yard. That we wouldn't be watching our own back door? Beside him stood Martha Henderson, no longer the determined ally, but a woman clearly terrified, a knife held to her throat by one of Rollins's men. I'm sorry, she called, her voice breaking. They caught me at the cellar door, forced me to play along. Touching performance, wasn't it? Rollins grinned, gesturing for his men to advance. The judge thought you might have accomplices in town. Seems he was right. Elias raised the revolver, though he knew it was futile against so many. 5 shots, perhaps 5 men down if his aim was perfect. And then what? They would still be outnumbered, outgunned, with Mrs. Henderson's life hanging in the balance. Lower the gun, Creed, Rollins ordered, or the old woman dies first, then the Swedish freak, and finally you slowly for the inconvenience you've caused. Time seemed to suspend as Elias weighed impossible options. Surrender meant certain death come dawn. Resistance meant certain death now, and likely for Mrs. Henderson as well. Either way, Harlan won his corruption and tyranny unchallenged. In that frozen moment of decision, Sarah's hand found his arm, her touch conveying solidarity regardless of his choice. They stood together, surrounded but unbroken, their dignity intact even as their freedom slipped away. Then from somewhere beyond the fence line, a single rifle shot shattered the night's stillness. The man holding Mrs. Henderson crumpled, the knife falling harmlessly from his suddenly lifeless hand. Before anyone could react, more shots rang out from the darkness beyond Harlan's property, precise and devastating. 2 of Rollins's men fell, then a third, the attacks coming from multiple directions with military precision. Ambush! Rollins shouted, diving for cover behind a nearby fountain. Return fire! Chaos erupted as Harlan's men shot blindly into the darkness, while their unseen attackers continued their deadly, accurate assault. Elias seized the opportunity, pulling Sarah down behind a stone planter as bullets whistled overhead. The fence, he urged, pointing toward the gap where the oak had pushed apart the rails. Now, while they're distracted, they crawled rapidly through the manicured grass, using the confusion and darkness as cover. Elias glanced back once to see Mrs. Henderson also taking advantage of the chaos, slipping away toward the servants' quarters at the side of the house. They reached the fence as the firefight intensified behind them. Elias helped Sarah through the gap, then squeezed through himself, ignoring the sharp pain as a broken rail tore his sleeve and the skin beneath. Beyond the fence waited Michael Donovan, rifle in hand, his weathered face grim in the moonlight. This way, he whispered, leading them toward a stand of trees where horses waited. The others will cover our retreat. As they mounted, Elias looked back at Harlan's compound, now a battleground of flashing gunfire and shouted orders. From his elevated position on horseback, he could see that their rescuers were far fewer than the fusillade had suggested, perhaps 5 or 6 men using the darkness and terrain to create the impression of a much larger force. Weber Erickson and a few others from town, Donovan explained, following his gaze. Good men with steady hands. They'll break contact once we're clear. They rode hard into the night, away from redemption, away from Harlan's reach, at least temporarily. Elias knew the respite would be brief. By dawn, Rollins would have a posse assembled, and the hunt would begin in earnest. But for now, they had won a small victory, carved out a moment of freedom from seemingly impossible odds. As they rode Sarah beside him on a horse that finally matched her stature, Elias felt something he had not experienced since before the war. Hope, fragile but undeniable, that justice might yet prevail against the forces arrayed against it. Then, just as they crested a hill overlooking the valley beyond, a shot rang out from the darkness behind them. Sarah jerked violently in her saddle, a startled cry escaping her lips as she began to slump forward. "Sarah!" Elias reached across the gap between their horses, managing to steady her before she could fall. Blood darkened her shirt, spreading rapidly from a wound in her back. "Keep riding," Donovan shouted as more shots followed the first. "Can't stop here!" Elias spurred his horse alongside Sarah's, supporting her with one arm, while guiding both mounts with his free hand. Her face had gone pale, her eyes unfocused with pain and shock. "Stay with me," he urged, his voice fierce with determination. "Don't you dare give up now." Her eyes found his clarity, struggling against encroaching darkness. "Not giving up," she managed through gritted teeth. "Just need a moment." Even wounded, possibly dying, that her courage remained unbroken. Elias felt something twist painfully in his chest, not just fear for her life, but recognition of what her loss would mean to him personally. This woman, whom he had known for barely a week, had somehow become essential to whatever future he might hope to build. The realization hit him with the force of revelation as they rode through the night, her blood warm against his supporting arm, her breath coming in labored gasps that he felt as acutely as if they were his own. He could not lose her now. Not when they had come so far. Not when they still had so far to go. "Hold on," he whispered, as much to himself as to her. "Just hold on." The eastern horizon had just begun to lighten when Donovan led them into a narrow canyon, following a path that would be invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. The trail wound between towering rock formations before opening into a small, hidden valley where a cabin stood beside a spring-fed pond. "My grandfather's hunting lodge," Donovan explained as they dismounted, carefully supporting Sarah between them. "Not comfortable, but secure. Harlan's men won't find it without a guide, and no one in these parts would help them." Inside the cabin was indeed sparse, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and bunks built into the walls. But it offered shelter, water from the spring, and a defensible position if their pursuers somehow tracked them. They laid Sarah face down on one of the bunks. Her breathing was shallow, her skin clammy with shock, but her eyes remained alert, tracking their movements with stubborn awareness. "Need to see the wound," Elias said, gently cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of her shirt with his knife. The bullet had entered just below her left shoulder blade, a ragged hole that still oozed dark blood. "No exit," he muttered, probing carefully around the edges of the wound. "Bullet's still in there." "How bad?" Sarah asked, her voice strained but it's steady. "I've seen worse survive," Elias replied, not sugarcoating the truth. "But we need to get that bullet out and stop the bleeding." Donovan was already building a fire, moving with the efficiency of a man accustomed to emergencies. "I'll heat water. Got some whiskey in that cabinet, not medicinal, but it'll have to do for disinfecting." "We need proper medical supplies," Elias began, but Donovan was ahead of him, pulling a worn leather satchel from beneath one of the bunks. "Field surgery kit," the farmer explained, opening it to reveal an assortment of instruments that had clearly seen use during the war. "Belonged to my brother, Army surgeon with the 8th Illinois. Died at Shiloh, but his kit made it home." While Donovan prepared, Elias knelt beside Sarah, meeting her eyes. "This is going to hurt," he said simply. "No way around it." A ghost of a smile touched her pale lips. "Not my first bullet." Elias raised an eyebrow, but she shook her head. "Story for another time, if there is one." "There will be," he promised, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "You're too stubborn to die from a coward's shot in the back." Her fingers tightened around his. "And you've got more promises to keep." Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but understood. Whatever happened next, whatever came after, they would face it together. The surgery was brutal, but mercifully quick. Sarah bore it with a stoicism that impressed even Donovan, who had seen his share of battlefield operations. She refused the leather strap offered to bite down on, gripping the edge of the bunk instead, until her knuckles turned white. Elias worked with the steady hands of a man who had performed such procedures before probing for the bullet, extracting it with forceps, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made Sarah's entire body tense with pain, then suturing the ragged flesh closed with neat, precise stitches. By the time he finished, dawn had broken fully, sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window. Sarah had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her breathing deep and regular in what Elias hoped was natural sleep, rather than the dangerous unconsciousness of blood loss. "She's strong," Donovan observed, washing blood from his hands in a basin by the fire. Most men would have passed out at the first probe. "She's had to be strong," Elias replied, covering her with a worn blanket. "The world hasn't given her much choice." Wiping his own hands clean, he moved to the window, scanning the valley below for any sign of pursuit. How many men can Harlan realistically gather for a manhunt? Rollins has about a dozen regulars, could probably recruit another 20 from town if needed, men who owe Harlan money or favors. And on our side, Weber and Erickson for certain, maybe a dozen other farmers who've had run-ins with the association. Sheriff Miller might help if he thought we had a chance. Donovan sighed heavily. "Not enough for a straight fight, if that's what you're asking." "It wasn't," Elias assured him. "Fighting Harlan head-on is suicide. We need to be smarter than that." He pulled Kane's ledger from his saddlebag, turning to the pages he had marked earlier. "These records detail every transaction the association has made for the past 5 years. Who paid what, who took what threats were made, what bribes were offered. Evidence that could destroy Harlan." Donovan nodded. "But only if it reaches the right authorities." "Exactly, and even then only if those authorities aren't already in Harlan's pocket." Elias frowned, paging through the ledger. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Henderson said about Pastor Collins sending a writer to Denver with partial copies of these documents." "Timothy Guthrie," Donovan confirmed. "Good man, fast writer. If anyone can make it to Denver without being caught, it's him." When would he arrive? Donovan calculated mentally. Left yesterday afternoon. Assuming no trouble, he'd reach Denver late tomorrow. And if Marshal Reynolds takes the evidence seriously, how long before he could reach redemption with enough men to arrest Harlan? 4 days minimum, more likely a week. Donovan's expression darkened. Time we might not have. "No," Elias agreed. "Harlan won't wait. After last night, he'll be desperate, afraid of what we know, what evidence we have against him. He'll come at us with everything he has." "So what's your plan, Captain?" Donovan asked, the military address slipping out unconsciously. Elias studied the valley beyond the window, his tactician's mind calculating distances, resources, vulnerabilities. "We need to draw Harlan out, force him to make a mistake, something public enough that even his allies can't ignore it." From the bunk, Sarah's voice startled them both. "The hanging." They turned to find her awake, pale but alert, struggling to sit up despite her injury. Elias moved quickly to her side, supporting her with a gentle hand. "You should rest," he admonished. Later, she dismissed the concern with a wince. "Listen, Harlan tried to hang me once in secret. After last night, he'll want to make an example, something public." Donovan nodded slowly. "She's right. Judge has a pattern. When someone crosses him bad enough, he stages a public execution. Calls it frontier justice. Last one was about a year ago, Homesteader, who shot one of Rollins's men for trespassing. So we let Harlan think he's caught us." Sarah continued, her eyes feverish with intensity. "Let him stage his show trial, his public hanging." "Absolutely not," Elias cut in. "We're not using you as bait." "Not me," Sarah clarified. "You." A heavy silence fell over the cabin as her meaning registered. Elias stared at her, seeing the tactical reasoning behind the suggestion, even as he rebelled against it. "Captain Creed, the ghost of Gettysburg," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The man who survived one hanging only to face another. Think of the symbolism. Harlan wouldn't be able to resist." "It's too risky," Elias objected. "If something goes wrong—" "Everything's already gone wrong," she interrupted. "We're out of safe choices. But we do have one advantage Harlan doesn't know about the cabin, doesn't know about the network of farmers ready to stand against him. He thinks we're alone, desperate." "Let him keep thinking that," Donovan added, warming to the plan. "Let him believe he's hunting a wounded fugitive and a dying woman. Meanwhile, we gather our forces, prepare an ambush of our own." Elias paced the small cabin, weighing options. The plan had merit, tactically speaking. Harlan's arrogance was his weakness, his certainty that he was always the smartest man in the room, always 3 steps ahead of his opponents. It made him predictable in ways he didn't realize. Even if we ambush Harlan during a public execution, Elias thought aloud, we'd still be outnumbered, outgunned. The element of surprise only goes so far. Unless we had reinforcements, Donovan suggested. Judge isn't the only one with friends in high places. I've been corresponding with the territorial governor's office for months documenting Harlan's abuses. Never had enough proof to warrant action, but with Kane's ledger. How quickly could you get a message to the governor? Elias asked, the outline of a plan forming in his mind. 2 days if I leave now and ride hard. Do it, Elias decided. Take copies of the most damning pages. Tell them everything: Harlan's real identity, the association's plans, the corruption of local law. Emphasize the urgency. The plan took shape swiftly. Donovan would ride for the territorial capital with copies of Kane's evidence. Weber would plant false evidence at the abandoned Mitchell homestead, making it appear that Elias had taken refuge there while Sarah had fled toward the mountains. Harlan would find the bait, capture Elias, and stage a public execution, at which point the farmers would rise up supported by the governor's men, if timing permitted. It was desperate, but no more desperate than their situation. By the 3rd day, with Donovan's return uncertain and Sarah still recovering from her wound, Elias prepared for his part in the deception. The abandoned Mitchell homestead had been carefully prepared: blood trails, torn clothing, and most importantly, edited copies of Kane's documents that would convince Harlan he had recovered the evidence while still believing there might be more hidden elsewhere. You're sure about this? Weber asked as Elias deliberately disheveled his appearance, rubbing dirt into his hair and beard. I'm sure, Elias replied, checking that the false documents were visible in his inner pocket. Harlan needs to believe he's won, needs to think he's recovered all the evidence. And if the governor's men don't arrive in time, Elias met his gaze steadily. Then we fight with what we have. It ends one way or another. He had said his farewell to Sarah that morning, a moment more charged with emotion than either had expected. Her eyes, fierce with determination, despite her weakened state, held his as she made him promise to return. You cut me down once, she had reminded him. My turn to return the favor. Now, as he positioned himself in the Mitchell homestead's main room, arranging the scene to suggest he had collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss, Elias found himself thinking not of tactics or escape routes, but of Sarah. Of the future they might build together if they survived this final confrontation. It was a future he had stopped believing possible after the war took everything from him: a home, a purpose, someone to share it with. He didn't have to wait long. Just as the afternoon light began to slant through the homestead's broken windows, he heard the thunder of approaching horses. Closing his eyes, he allowed his body to go slack in simulated unconsciousness as boots thumped on the porch and the door crashed open. Check every room, Rollins's voice cut through the chaos. He's here somewhere. Elias remained motionless as Boots approached. Stopping beside him, a toe nudged his ribs, not gently. Found him, Rollins called. Looks half dead already. Rough hands seized Elias, dragging him to a sitting position against the wall. He allowed his eyes to flutter open, feigning disorientation. Rollins crouched before him, scarred face split in a triumphant grin. End of the line, Creed. Where's the woman? Gone. Elias managed his voice deliberately weak. Sent her ahead, too injured to travel fast. While his men searched the property, Rollins discovered the ledger visible in Elias's coat. He yanked it free, flipping through the pages with growing satisfaction. Well, the famous records. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. All of them, all I could carry, Elias replied. Rest are hidden. Burn if I don't return. It was the perfect bait, suggesting there were more documents beyond what Rollins had found, but not immediately accessible. Enough to make Harlan desperate to keep Elias alive until he revealed their location. The trial the next morning was a mockery of justice, as Elias had expected. By 10:30, he had been found guilty on all charges. By 10:40, he stood on the hastily constructed gallows in Redemption's town square, hands bound behind him, a noose of new rope dangling before him. Harlan himself had ascended the steps to address the gathered crowd, playing his role as the arbiter of justice with consummate skill. The judge cut an impressive figure in his black robes, silver hair catching the morning sun voice, carrying clearly across the hushed square. Citizens of redemption, he began. We gather today not in celebration, but in solemn duty. The man before you, Elias Creed, came to our community as a stranger and repaid our hospitality with violence and sedition. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, not all of them supportive. Elias noted the division, Harlan's men nodding in grim approval, the ordinary townspeople shifting uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. The court has found him guilty of crimes against the peace and prosperity of our town, Harlan continued. And in accordance with the authority vested in me by the territorial legislature, I have sentenced him to hang by the neck until dead. He turned to Elias' voice, dropping to a register only those on the platform could hear. Any last words, Captain? Perhaps you'd like to tell me where the rest of Kane's documents are hidden, or the location of your Swedish accomplice. A reprieve might still be arranged. Elias met his gaze steadily. I do have words, Harrison. Not for you, but for them. He nodded toward the crowd. Let me speak to them. One soldier to his countrymen. Something like curiosity flickered in Harlan's eyes. Very well. A condemned man's last request. He stepped back, gesturing for Elias to address the gathering, and Elias raised his voice, speaking not with the desperation of a doomed man, but with the quiet authority that had once commanded troops in battle. People of redemption, he began. Most of you don't know me. I came here seeking peace after years of war, hoping to build something rather than destroy. What I found instead was another kind of war not fought with cannons and rifles, but with fear and intimidation. The crowd had gone utterly silent, hanging on his words. Even Rollins, standing at the foot of the gallows, seemed transfixed. The man who calls himself Judge Howard Harlan is not who he claims to be. Elias continued, his voice gathering strength. During the war, he was Colonel Howard Harrison of the 12th Pennsylvania, a Union officer who ordered the illegal execution of 19 Confederate prisoners at Gettysburg, men who had surrendered honorably, who were entitled to protection under the rules of war. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the crowd. Harlan's face darkened with fury, but before he could interrupt, Elias pressed on. After the war, he reinvented himself as a Confederate sympathizer, building a power base among displaced Southerners while secretly advancing his own ambitions. The Reconstruction Association isn't about restoring the South's honor. It's about creating a personal fiefdom for a man who betrayed both North and South for his own gain. Enough, Harlan snarled, signaling to Rollins. Proceed with the execution. But Elias wasn't finished. The proof is in Kane's ledger's records of bribes, threats, illegal land seizures. Records that are already on their way to the territorial governor, along with sworn statements from citizens of this town who have suffered under Harlan's rule. Rollins had reached the platform, now moving to position the noose around Elias's neck. But all around the square, the crowd was shifting, muttering, the mood turning dangerous. This isn't justice, Elias called out as the rough hemp settled against his skin. This is the desperate act of a tyrant who knows his time is ending. Hang him now, Harlan ordered, his composure cracking. Rollins moved to the lever that would open the trap door beneath Elias's feet. The crowd held its collective breath. In that frozen moment, Elias scanned the horizon beyond the town, searching for any sign of the promised reinforcements. Nothing but empty roads stretched into the distance. The plan had failed. The governor's men would not arrive in time. Rollins's hand closed around the lever. Harlan's face twisted in triumphant malice. The crowd tensed in anticipation of the drop. Then from somewhere at the edge of the square, a single shot rang out. Rollins jerked backward, and a red stain blossoming on his chest as he toppled from the platform. Chaos erupted instantly. More shots followed, precise and devastating. Harlan's men fell one after another, cut down by unseen marksmen firing from windows and rooftops around the square. And there, pushing through the panicked crowd with inhuman strength despite her injury, came Sarah Nordstrom. She moved like an avenging fury, a rifle clutched in her massive hands, her pale eyes fixed on the gallows where Harlan stood, frozen in shock. Harrison, she called her, his voice carrying above the pandemonium. Face me, you coward! Harlan recovered quickly, drawing a derringer from within his robes. He grabbed Elias, using him as a shield while pressing the small pistol to his temple. Stay back, he shouted to Sarah. One more step, and he dago. Sarah halted, rifle raised, but unable to risk a shot with Elias in the line of fire. Around the square, Harlan's remaining men regrouped weapons trained on the farmers who had emerged from hiding. A standoff with Elias caught in the middle. "It's over, Harrison," Elias said quietly. "Look around you. The town is lost. Your men are outnumbered. Surrender now, face a proper trial, and you might yet live." "Surrender to whom?" Harlan sneered. "A rabble of farmers. A freakish woman, I think not." He began backing toward the stairs, dragging Elias with him. "I'm leaving this godforsaken place, and you're my passport out." Before he could reach the steps, another figure appeared at the top of the gallows. Sheriff Miller, his ancient Colt revolver leveled at Harlan's head. "Drop the gun, Judge." Miller ordered, his voice steady despite his age. "It's finished." Harlan's eyes darted between Miller and Sarah, calculating his dwindling options. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff. Stand aside and I'll remember your loyalty when this is over." "Only mistake I made was looking the other way too long," Miller replied. "Now drop the gun before I drop you." For a moment it seemed Harlan might comply. His grip on the derringer loosened fractionally, his shoulders slumping in apparent defeat. Then, with the desperate speed of a cornered predator, he swung the gun towards Sarah. "If I die, she dies with me." 3 shots thundered simultaneously. Miller's revolver, Sarah's rifle, and a third from somewhere in the crowd. Harlan staggered the derringer, falling from nerveless fingers as 3 separate wounds blossomed across his chest. He looked down at the spreading crimson stain with an expression of almost comical surprise. "Impossible," he whispered before toppling forward onto the wooden platform. Howard Harland, or Harrison, former colonel, false judge, architect of oppression, lay dead at Elias's feet, his blood seeping between the rough boards to drip onto the earth below. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah rushed forward, using her knife to cut Elias free of his bonds. Their eyes met in a moment of shared disbelief. They had survived against all odds. "The governor's men?" Elias asked as she helped him remove the noose. "Delayed by a broken bridge," she explained. "Donovan rode ahead to warn us." She nodded toward the crowd where the stocky farmer stood with Weber and Erickson, all 3 looking battered but triumphant. "We decided not to wait." "Good decision," Elias acknowledged, rubbing his chafed wrists. "Though cutting it rather close, don't you think?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Dramatic effect. 1 month later, the farm was transformed. The old oak tree that had nearly claimed Sarah's life had been felled in the season's first snowfall, its wood now serving as the central beam for their expanded farmhouse, a symbol of transformation that seemed fitting to them both. The territorial governor had kept his word, sending not only troops to restore order, but also a special investigator who spent days poring over Kane's ledgers and interviewing townspeople. Rawlins's surviving men were transported to Denver to await trial. A new judge had been appointed, someone with no ties to the old power structure. Samuel Kane had been captured, trying to cross into Mexico, the money he had embezzled, recovered, and returned to redemption to help those who had suffered under Harlan's regime. As for Elias and Sarah, they had formalized their partnership, in every sense legal ownership of the farm, divided equally between them, their shared vision for its development extending years into the future. And in the quiet evenings when the day's work was done, they had begun to explore the deeper connection that had formed between them during their ordeal. "House is going to be twice the size I planned when I bought this place," Elias observed as they sat on the porch watching the last of the day's light fade from the western sky. "Complaining?" Sarah asked, an eyebrow raised in challenge. "Observing," he corrected with a smile. "Plans change, sometimes for the better." She accepted the cup of coffee he offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange, a small intimacy that neither took for granted. "I had a letter from Mrs. Henderson today," Sarah said after a comfortable silence. "She's been elected to the town council. First woman in Redemption's history." "Good choice," Elias approved. "Town could use her practical wisdom." "She asked if we'd consider coming in for the Christmas gathering at the church. Said Pastor Collins specifically requested our presence." Elias had been avoiding town, still uncomfortable with the way people looked at him. Some with gratitude, others with wariness, all with the awareness that he had changed the course of their community forever. "Perhaps it's time," he acknowledged. "Can't stay isolated out here forever." Sarah studied him with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see through all his defenses. Still not comfortable being seen as a hero. "I'm no hero," he denied automatically. "Just a man who couldn't watch another injustice without acting." That's the definition of a hero, Elias, she countered gently. Not someone perfect or fearless, but someone who acts despite the cost. He had no response to that, so he simply took her hand instead, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Together they watched as the workers finished securing the oak beam, its weathered strength now supporting new growth rather than dealing death. Like the beam, they had been transformed not by erasing the past, but by giving it new purpose. The rope that had nearly claimed Sarah's life had been cut, but other bonds had formed in its place, bonds of choice and trust and emerging love, stronger than any hemp or chain could ever be. These were the bindings that would hold, as they built their future one day at a time, in a place finally worthy of its name, redemption.